Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Park Ranger. Marcus Sullivan had been working the backcountry of Olympic National Park for 7 years when he stumbled across something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. It was mid-October 2019, and the autumn rains had started early that year, turning the forest floor into a carpet of rotting leaves and making every step squelch with moisture. Marcus was conducting a routine patrol of the Enchanted Valley area, checking the isolated campsites that dotted the remote wilderness corridors where only the most dedicated hikers ventured. The Enchanted Valley wasn't actually enchanted, despite what the name suggested. It was a long, narrow valley carved by the Quinault River, surrounded by towering peaks and accessible only by a grueling 15-mile hike through dense forest. Most visitors stuck to the main trail, but scattered throughout the valley were a dozen primitive campsites, little more than clearings in the woods where backpackers could pitch their tents away from the crowds. Marcus had been assigned to check these sites because of recent reports of illegal camping and improper waste disposal. It wasn't glamorous work, but someone had to do it. The backcountry sites were supposed to be reserved in advance, and campers were required to follow strict leave no trace principles. Lately, though, they'd been finding evidence of unauthorized camping and worse. Human waste left in inappropriate places, food scraps that attracted bears, and camping gear abandoned when people decided the wilderness was too much for them. The first 3 sites Marcus checked that morning were clean. Site 4 had some charcoal remains from an illegal campfire, which he documented with his camera and GPS unit. Sites 5 and 6 were empty and undisturbed. It wasn't until he reached Site 7, tucked deep in a grove of old-growth Douglas firs, that he found something that made him stop dead in his tracks. The campsite looked like someone had left in the middle of the night. A blue dome tent sat perfectly pitched in the center of the clearing, its rainfly stretched tight and properly staked. Next to it, a camp stove was set up on a flat rock, with a pot still sitting on the burner. A pair of hiking boots sat neatly beside the tent entrance, positioned as if their owner had just stepped out of them. Everything looked normal, organized, intentional, except there was no one there. Marcus circled the campsite slowly, his trained eye taking in the details. The tent was a high-quality model, probably worth $400 or $500. The boots were expensive too. Well-worn, but well-maintained. This wasn't the gear of some casual weekend warrior who'd gotten in over their head. This belonged to someone who knew what they were doing in the wilderness. He called out, his voice echoing off the surrounding trees. "Hello? Anyone around?" Nothing answered except the sound of water dripping from the canopy above. He tried again, louder this time. "This is Park Service." "Is anyone here?" Still nothing. Marcus approached the tent cautiously. The zipper was pulled shut, but he could see through the mesh window that there were items inside. He knew he shouldn't enter without permission, but something about the scene felt wrong. The campsite was too perfect, too undisturbed. If someone had gone for a hike, they would have taken their boots. If they'd gone to get water, they would have taken the pot. He unzipped the tent door and peered inside. What he saw made his stomach clench. The sleeping bag was laid out but hadn't been slept in. Personal items were scattered around the tent floor in a way that suggested someone had been going through them quickly. A wallet, car keys, a cell phone, reading glasses, medication bottles. But what really caught his attention was the notebook lying open near the head of the sleeping bag. Marcus pulled on his latex gloves and carefully picked up the notebook. The handwriting was neat, methodical, the entries dated. It appeared to be some kind of hiking journal. He flipped to the most recent entry, dated 3 days earlier, October 12th. Made it to Site 7 around 4 p.m. Beautiful spot, completely secluded. Weather holding up, but rain expected tomorrow. Planning to spend 2 nights here before pushing on to Site 12. Haven't seen another soul since yesterday morning. This is exactly what I needed. The entry was signed with initials, DK. Marcus flipped back through the pages. The entries went back several weeks and chronicled an extensive solo backpacking trip through the Olympic Peninsula. Whoever DK was, they were an experienced hiker. The journal contained detailed observations about trail conditions, wildlife sightings, weather patterns, and campsite conditions. This person knew what they were doing. He set the journal aside and picked up the wallet. The driver's license inside belonged to Daniel Kenneth Morrison, age 34, from Seattle. The photo showed a lean man with dark hair and intelligent eyes. Marcus made note of the information and carefully returned everything to where he'd found it. Outside the tent, he began a more thorough search of the area. The campsite showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. The camp stove had been turned off properly. The food bag was hung correctly on a bear line 12 feet up in a nearby tree. Everything had been done by the book, which made the abandonment even more puzzling. Marcus expanded his search pattern, walking in widening circles around the campsite. About 50 yards away, he found something that made him radio immediately for backup. A hiking backpack, expensive and well-made, sat propped against a tree. It had been opened and items were scattered on the ground around it. Extra clothes, a first aid kit, water purification tablets, energy bars. It looked like someone had been searching through it urgently. But the most disturbing part wasn't what was there, it was what wasn't. The backpack should have contained at least 2 days' worth of food for a solo hiker, but Marcus could only account for a few energy bars and a single freeze-dried meal. Either Daniel had been rationing his supplies carefully, or someone else had taken them. Within an hour, 2 other rangers had arrived at the site. Nancy Walsh brought the tracking dog, a German shepherd named Ranger who was trained in the search and rescue. The 3rd ranger, Arthur Torres, was an expert in wilderness crime scene investigation, a specialty that was becoming increasingly necessary as more people ventured into remote areas. The dog picked up a scent immediately. Daniel had definitely been at the campsite, and the trail led away from the tent in a direction that didn't correspond with any known hiking trail. Arthur began documenting everything with a professional camera while Nancy worked with the dog to follow the scent trail. The trail led through dense forest for about a quarter mile before reaching a steep ravine. The dog became agitated at the edge, whining and circling. Nancy coaxed him to continue, and the trail resumed on the other side, but it was weaker now, fragmented. They followed it for another hour before it disappeared entirely at a creek crossing. Back at the campsite, Arthur was making disturbing discoveries. The camp stove, which had appeared to be simply turned off, showed signs of having been shut down quickly. There was partially burned food stuck to the bottom of the pot, suggesting someone had been interrupted while cooking. More concerning were the scratches he found on trees around the perimeter of the campsite. Fresh gouges in the bark about 6 feet off the ground, too high to have been made by any local wildlife. Marcus found himself studying Daniel's journal more carefully while the others worked. The entries told the story of a man seeking solitude after what appeared to be a difficult divorce. Several entries mentioned needing to clear his head and figure things out. But there was nothing in the writing that suggested depression or suicidal ideation. If anything, Daniel seemed to be finding peace in the wilderness. One entry from a week earlier caught Marcus's attention. October 6th. Strange encounter today on the trail. Met another hiker about 10 miles back who seemed agitated about something. He kept asking if I'd seen anyone else on the trail, if I'd noticed anyone following me. When I said no, he warned me to be careful in the backcountry. Said there were people out there who weren't what they seemed. Probably just paranoid from too much isolation, but it stuck with me. As the afternoon wore on, the search team expanded their efforts. They found more disturbing evidence scattered throughout the surrounding forest. About 100 yards from the campsite, Nancy's dog located a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was the same color and material as a jacket Marcus had seen in Daniel's backpack. 50 yards further, they found a hiking pole, broken in half and lying in some thick underbrush. But the most unsettling discovery came as the sun was beginning to set. Arthur, who had been methodically photographing the scene, noticed something odd about the positioning of items in the scattered backpack. They weren't randomly strewn around as you'd expect if someone had been searching through them. Instead, they were arranged in a rough circle around the tree, as if they'd been placed there deliberately. In the center of the circle, partially buried under fallen leaves, was a small digital camera. Arthur carefully excavated it and turned it on. The battery was nearly dead, but there was enough power to scroll through the photos. Most were typical hiking shots, scenic vistas, wildlife, campsite photos. But the last few images were different. The first showed the view from inside Daniel's tent, taken apparently at night. The mesh window revealed only darkness outside, but there was something in the shadows at the edge of the frame that looked like it might be a human figure. The second photo was completely black, as if the camera had been triggered accidentally. The third and final photo was the most disturbing. It showed what appeared to be multiple sets of boot prints in soft earth, all different sizes and tread patterns, forming a circle around what looked like the remains of a small campfire. Marcus stared at the camera's LCD screen as the battery finally died. "Arthur," he called out, his voice tight. "We need to get this thing back to the station and see if we can enhance these images." As darkness fell, the team was forced to abandon the search for the night. They sealed Daniel's tent and marked the entire area as a potential crime scene. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important, some crucial detail that would explain what had happened to Daniel Morrison. That night, back at the ranger station, Marcus filed his initial report while Arthur worked on extracting the photos from Daniel's camera. The images, when enhanced and enlarged, were even more disturbing than they'd appeared on the small screen. The figure outside the tent was definitely human, but something about the posture and positioning seemed wrong, unnatural. The boot prints around the fire showed clear evidence that multiple people had been in that location, but the prints didn't match any of the standard hiking boot patterns Marcus was familiar with. The next morning brought rain, which complicated the search efforts. Any tracks or scent trails that might have remained were quickly washed away. Marcus led a larger team back to Site 7, determined to find more clues about Daniel's disappearance. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Someone had been to the campsite during the night. Daniel's tent had been moved, not damaged or disturbed, but carefully relocated about 10 feet from its original position. The camp stove and cooking pot were gone. Most mysteriously, new items had been left behind. A child's stuffed animal, a faded and dirty teddy bear, sat in the exact spot where the tent had originally been pitched. Next to it was a single worn boot, much older and more weathered than the pair Daniel had left behind. Nancy's dog refused to approach the new items. The animal whined and backed away whenever she tried to lead him closer, behavior she'd never seen from him before. Arthur photographed everything carefully, but even he seemed unnerved by the overnight changes. Marcus picked up the stuffed animal with his gloved hands. It was old, probably decades old, and had obviously been exposed to the elements for a long time. The fur was matted and discolored, and there was something dark stained into the fabric that could have been dirt or could have been something else. A small tag inside the animal bore the name Jenny, written in faded marker. The boot was even more puzzling. It was a hiking boot, but an old style that hadn't been manufactured in at least 20 years. The leather was cracked and weathered, and the sole was worn completely smooth in places. Inside the boot, they found a folded piece of paper that had been yellowed by age and moisture. Marcus carefully unfolded the paper. It was a page torn from what looked like another hiking journal, dated 15 years earlier. The entry was brief but chilling. "Can't sleep. They're out there watching. I can hear them moving around the campsite. Sarah thinks I'm paranoid, but she's scared too, I can tell. We're going to try to hike out at first light. If something happens to us, if we don't make it out, I hope someone finds this and knows we tried to get away." There was no signature, just initials, RB. Marcus felt his blood run cold. 15 years ago, there had been a disappearance in this same area. A couple from Portland, Robert and Sarah Blake, had vanished during a backpacking trip. Their car had been found at the trailhead, but despite extensive searches, no trace of them had ever been discovered. The case had eventually been closed as a presumed wilderness accident. As the search for Daniel Morrison continued over the following days, the team made more disturbing discoveries. At Site 9, 2 miles deeper into the backcountry, they found another abandoned campsite. This one was older, with vegetation beginning to reclaim the cleared area. A faded tent, partially collapsed and covered in moss, contained the remnants of gear that appeared to be at least 5 years old. In the tent, they found identification belonging to Carol Martinez, a solo hiker from California who had been reported missing in 2015. Site 12 yielded similar results. An old campsite with scattered gear and personal effects belonging to Gregory Stone, missing since 2017. The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. People weren't just disappearing in the Enchanted Valley, their campsites were being preserved, maintained, turned into some kind of shrine or collection. Marcus began researching missing persons cases in Olympic National Park going back decades. What he found kept him awake at night. Over the past 30 years, at least 17 people had vanished in the Enchanted Valley area. All were experienced hikers, all were well prepared for wilderness travel, and all had simply vanished without a trace. But the official records told only part of the story. Marcus started reaching out to search and rescue volunteers, retired rangers, anyone who might have knowledge of unofficial incidents or rumors. What he learned painted an even darker picture. An old-timer named Vincent Walsh, who'd worked search and rescue in the area for over 40 years, told him about campsites that searchers had learned to avoid. There were places, Vincent said, where we'd find things that didn't make sense. Personal items arranged in patterns like someone was collecting them. Campsites that looked lived in but had no people. We started to think someone was living out there. Someone who didn't want to be found. Vincent told him about a search in 1995 when a family of 4 had gone missing. The official report stated that no trace of them was ever found, but Vincent remembered differently. "We found their campsite," he said. "Everything was there, tents, sleeping bags, food, clothes. But the family was gone, and there were signs that other people had been there, people who weren't part of the search team. Boot prints that didn't match any of our people." The search had been called off after 2 weeks, Vincent explained, but not because they'd given up hope of finding the family alive. It was because members of the search team had started reporting being watched, followed. People claimed to see figures in the trees, movements in the shadows that didn't belong to searchers or wildlife. 2 volunteers had quit after claiming someone had gone through their gear during the night while they slept. Marcus realized that the Daniel Morrison case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something larger, something that had been going on for decades. But who was responsible? And what happened to the people who disappeared? The answer came 3 weeks into the search, in a way that Marcus could never have anticipated. He was conducting a solo patrol of a remote trail, following up on a reported sighting of someone matching Daniel's description. The trail was barely maintained, more of an old game path than a proper hiking route. Marcus was several miles from the nearest road when he heard voices ahead. He approached carefully, using the dense forest as cover. Through the trees, he could see a small clearing where 4 people were sitting around a fire. At first glance, they looked like ordinary backpackers taking a break. But something about the scene felt wrong. Their gear was mismatched, clearly cobbled together from different sources. One man was wearing a hiking jacket that was far too large for him, while another had boots that were obviously meant for someone with smaller feet. A woman in the group wore a backpack that Marcus recognized from one of the crime scene photos. It had belonged to Carol Martinez. Marcus crept closer, trying to get a better look without being seen. The conversation he overheard made his blood freeze. They were discussing the new one, clearly referring to Daniel Morrison. One of the men, a gaunt figure with long hair and weathered skin, was angry that the others had let Daniel get away before they could bring him to the collection. Another member of the group, a woman with wild eyes and torn clothing, insisted that Daniel would be back. "They always come back," she said. "Once they see what we've left for them, they get curious. He'll return to his campsite and then we'll be ready." Marcus realized with growing horror that he was listening to people who had been living in the wilderness for years, possibly decades. They spoke about other hikers with casual familiarity, referring to them by first names and discussing their gear as if it were inventory. These weren't random criminals who had stumbled upon an opportunity. They were organized, experienced, and they had been doing this for a long time. The gaunt man pulled something from his pack. Daniel's missing hiking pole, the one Marcus's team hadn't been able to find. "He dropped this when he ran," the man said. "Good quality, better than the one Sarah had." Marcus felt sick as he realized they were talking about Sarah Blake, the woman who had disappeared 15 years earlier. As Marcus listened, the full scope of the operation became clear. This group, and possibly others like them, had been systematically targeting solo hikers and small groups in the remote areas of the park. They would watch potential victims, learn their routines, and then make their move when the hikers were most vulnerable. Some victims were killed immediately, but others were kept alive, possibly forced to help with future operations. The woman with wild eyes began describing how they had trained some of their captives to help with hunting new victims. Marcus realized with horror that some of the missing hikers might not be dead at all, but had been turned into reluctant accomplices through years of captivity and psychological conditioning. But the most disturbing revelation came when the gaunt man opened a leather pouch and began sorting through what appeared to be identification cards and driver's licenses. Marcus could see dozens of them, all belonging to different people, collected over what must have been years of operations. Some of the faces in the photos looked familiar from missing persons bulletins he'd seen over the years. "We need to be more careful about selection," said another group member, an older woman with gray hair and deeply tanned skin. "The Park Service is starting to pay attention to the patterns. Too many disappearances in the same area." The gaunt man shrugged. "There are other parks, other valleys. We've been here long enough anyway. Maybe it's time to move the operation." Marcus felt a chill as he realized they were talking about relocating their activities to other wilderness areas, potentially spreading their predatory behavior across the entire national park system. These weren't just local criminals. They were part of something much larger and more organized. As the group continued their discussion, Marcus learned more disturbing details about their methods. They had established a network of hidden camps throughout the wilderness, connected by unmarked trails that allowed them to move unseen between locations. Some camps were used for holding captives, others for processing and storing the belongings they took from victims. The woman with gray hair mentioned the buyers, people who apparently paid for certain types of victims or specific personal items. Marcus realized that this wasn't just about survival or territorial behavior. There was a commercial aspect to the operation, with outside parties paying for access to captives or trophies. The Seattle hiker's wallet brought good money, she said, referring to what must have been Daniel Morrison. That watch alone was worth more than we usually see in a month. Marcus documented as much as he could from his hidden position, taking photographs with his phone's zoom function and recording snippets of conversation. But as he shifted position to get a better angle, a branch snapped beneath his foot. The conversation stopped immediately. The group members looked toward the sound, their body language changing from relaxed discussion to alert wariness. Marcus saw hands move toward weapons, knives, hatchets, and what looked like a modified crossbow. "Someone's listening," whispered the gray-haired woman. Marcus began backing away as quietly as possible, but it was too late. The group had spread out, moving through the forest with practiced stealth to surround his position. These people knew the wilderness intimately, and they had years of experience hunting humans through dense forest. Marcus ran, abandoning any attempt at stealth for speed. Behind him, he could hear the group coordinating their pursuit, calling out positions and directions to each other. But their voices sounded calm, almost businesslike, as if this was routine for them. The chase lasted over an hour, with Marcus using every technique he'd learned in 7 years of backcountry work to evade capture. He crossed streams, doubled back on his trail, and used dense undergrowth to break line of sight. But his pursuers seemed to anticipate his moves, cutting off escape routes and forcing him toward areas where they could more easily corner him. Finally, Marcus reached a section of trail that connected to the main hiking routes, where he encountered a group of legitimate hikers heading back toward the trailhead. The presence of witnesses apparently convinced his pursuers to break off the chase, but Marcus could see them watching from the tree line as he joined the hiking group. Marcus made it back to the ranger station and immediately called for law enforcement backup from multiple agencies. When search teams returned to the clearing where he'd observed the group, they found clear evidence of recent occupation, but no sign of the people themselves. The investigation that followed revealed a complex network of hidden camps and supply caches throughout the Olympic wilderness. Items belonging to dozens of missing hikers were recovered from these locations, along with journals and records that documented years of predatory activity. But despite the evidence, most of the group members were never apprehended. They had vanished into the vast wilderness as completely as their victims, leaving behind only the traces of their activities and the personal belongings of people who would never be found. The case files revealed that similar patterns of disappearances had been documented in other national parks across the country, suggesting that the Olympic operation was part of a larger network of wilderness predators who moved between different locations to avoid detection. Marcus continued working as a park ranger, but he was transferred to a different section of Olympic National Park, away from the Enchanted Valley area. The backcountry campsites where Daniel Morrison and others had disappeared were permanently closed to public access, officially due to environmental protection concerns. Daniel Morrison's case remains open, along with those of 17 other people who vanished in the same area. His family continues to search for answers, but the wilderness keeps its secrets well. Sometimes, hikers in other parts of the park report finding abandoned campsites with expensive gear left behind, or claim to see people watching them from the forest. Marcus knows that somewhere in the deep places of America's wilderness, there are people who view other human beings as prey to be hunted and collected. They understand the vastness of the backcountry and use it as both hunting ground and sanctuary, operating beyond the reach of law enforcement or civilized society. The personal effects recovered from the hidden camps were returned to families when possible, but many items belonged to people whose disappearances had never been reported or investigated. These unclaimed belongings now sit in evidence storage, representing unknown victims whose fate will never be known. Every year, thousands of people venture into America's wilderness areas, seeking solitude and natural beauty. Most return safely with nothing more than memories of peaceful landscapes and wildlife encounters. But some don't return at all, and their campsites become part of a collection maintained by people who have claimed the wilderness as their own hunting preserve. Marcus kept one photograph from the investigation, though he was never supposed to. It showed Daniel Morrison's campsite as they had found it that first day: the perfectly pitched tent, the neatly arranged gear, the hiking boots placed just so beside the entrance. Everything looked normal, as if Daniel had simply stepped away for a moment and would return at any time. But Marcus knows that Daniel never returned to that campsite, and never will. Somewhere in the trackless wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula, his story became part of a much darker narrative, one that continues to unfold in the places where civilization ends and something far more primitive takes over. The wilderness doesn't judge the people who enter it, doesn't distinguish between those seeking peace and those seeking prey. It simply provides the space and the silence necessary for both pursuits, keeping the secrets of what happens in its deepest places away from the light of civilized understanding. Marcus looks at that photograph sometimes and wonders how many other perfect campsites are waiting out there in the wilderness, with all the gear neatly arranged and everything ready for an owner who will never return. The thought keeps him awake some nights, listening to the sounds of the forest and wondering what else might be listening back. The first time Park Ranger Vincent Drake heard about the Blackwood incident, he was sitting in a dingy coffee shop in Cook City, Montana, 3 years after he'd quit the National Park Service. It was February 2024, and the retired ranger was nursing his third cup of coffee, while the blizzard outside buried his truck under 2 feet of fresh powder. The man across from him, investigative journalist Michael Torres, had been chasing the story for months. "I need you to tell me what really happened in Specimen Ridge," Torres said, sliding a manila envelope across the scarred wooden table. "The official reports don't add up. Too many gaps, too many inconsistencies." Vincent stared at the envelope without touching it. He'd spent the last 3 years trying to forget Specimen Ridge, trying to convince himself that what he'd witnessed during that November in 2021 had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. The nightmares had finally started to fade. The last thing he needed was to drag it all back up. "I told the FBI everything I knew," Vincent said. "Case is closed." "The case was buried," Torres corrected. 12 missing persons, Vincent. 12 people vanished from areas surrounding Yellowstone in a 6-month period, and the official explanation is wilderness accidents. But you and I both know that's not what happened. Torres opened the envelope and spread out a collection of photographs, newspaper clippings, and police reports. Vincent recognized some of the faces from missing person flyers he'd seen years earlier. Hikers, hunters, backpackers, all experienced outdoors people who had simply vanished without a trace. "The pattern didn't become clear until I started looking at the bigger picture," Torres continued. "All of these disappearances occurred within a 50-mile radius of areas where illegal hunting operations had been suspected, but never proven. And they all happened during the same time frame when you were conducting those special patrols in Specimen Ridge. Vincent pushed back from the table, but Torres wasn't finished. I've been investigating organized hunting networks for 5 years, Vincent. I know about the wealthy clients, the guides who take them into restricted areas, the corruption that makes it all possible. But the Specimen Ridge operation was different, wasn't it? More sophisticated, more dangerous. Vincent looked out at the swirling snow and remembered another winter day 3 years earlier, when he discovered that some hunts involve prey that fights back with more than just instinct and desperation. That some hunters become the hunted in ways they never could have imagined. You want to know what happened at Specimen Ridge? Vincent said finally. You want to know why I quit the Park Service and moved to this godforsaken town where nobody asks questions about the past? Torres leaned forward, pulling out a digital recorder. That's exactly what I want to know. Vincent stared at the device for a long moment, then gestured for Torres to turn it off. Not yet. First, you need to understand what kind of people we're dealing with. Then you need to decide if you really want to publish a story that could get both of us killed. It started in September 2021, when Vincent was assigned to investigate reports of unusual activity in the Specimen Ridge Wilderness area. The region had been closed to public access for 3 years, officially for wildlife research, but lately there had been reports from adjacent hiking areas of gunshots echoing from the Forbidden Zone. Vincent had been with the Park Service for 8 years, specializing in backcountry law enforcement and wildlife crime investigation. He'd seen his share of poachers and illegal hunting operations, but something about the Specimen Ridge reports felt different. The gunshots weren't random or opportunistic. They followed patterns that suggested organized professional operations. His supervisor, District Ranger Carol Brennan, had been unusually specific about the assignment. We need someone who can operate independently and won't ask too many questions, she told him during their briefing. This investigation requires a light touch. Document what you find, but don't take any enforcement action without clearing it with me first. The instructions had struck Vincent as odd at the time. Park Service policy was usually to investigate and stop illegal activities as soon as they were discovered. But Brennan had emphasized that this case was politically sensitive and required careful handling. Vincent's first patrol into Specimen Ridge revealed immediate evidence of organized hunting activity. He found well-established trails that didn't appear on any official maps, leading to hidden camps equipped with sophisticated gear. The camps were temporary but professional. Canvas shelters, portable generators, communication equipment, and processing stations for preparing game. But the most disturbing discovery was the scale of the operation. Based on the evidence Vincent found, this wasn't a small group of local poachers. The camps could accommodate dozens of people, and the processing stations were designed to handle large volumes of game. Someone was running a commercial hunting operation in one of America's most protected wilderness areas. Vincent documented everything he found and reported back to Brennan, expecting immediate action. Instead, she told him to continue surveillance and gather more intelligence. We need to understand the full scope of this operation before we move, she explained. These people are well connected and well funded. If we're going to shut them down, we need to do it right. Over the following weeks, Vincent conducted regular patrols into Specimen Ridge, building a detailed picture of the hunting operation. He discovered that the camps were rotated frequently to different locations, following a sophisticated schedule that avoided detection by normal park patrols. The operation used advanced equipment including night vision gear, satellite communication systems, and vehicles modified for silent running. But it wasn't until October that Vincent realized the true nature of what was happening in Specimen Ridge. During a nighttime surveillance operation, he witnessed something that changed his understanding of the entire situation. Vincent was positioned on a ridge overlooking one of the hunting camps when a convoy of vehicles arrived. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows, moving without headlights through terrain that should have been impassable for normal vehicles. The vehicles stopped at the camp, and Vincent watched through binoculars as their occupants emerged. The people getting out of the vehicles weren't typical hunters or guides. They moved with military precision, wore tactical gear, and carried weapons that Vincent recognized as military-grade assault rifles. This wasn't a hunting operation. It was a paramilitary exercise. Vincent observed the group for over an hour, photographing their activities and recording their conversations when possible. What he saw defied explanation. The armed group was apparently conducting training exercises using live targets, but the targets weren't animals. Through his binoculars, Vincent watched as the group released what appeared to be human subjects into the wilderness, then began tracking them using sophisticated equipment. The subjects were given minimal supplies and a head start, then hunted through the forest by teams of armed pursuers. Vincent realized he was witnessing something that went far beyond illegal hunting. This was human hunting. Wealthy clients paying enormous sums to hunt other human beings in America's wilderness areas. The targets appeared to be people who wouldn't be missed. Transients, undocumented immigrants, individuals with no family connections or social networks. The sophistication of the operation was staggering. The hunters used thermal imaging equipment, communication networks, and coordinated tactics that suggested military or law enforcement training. The prey were given just enough of a chance to make the hunt challenging, but the outcome was never in doubt. Vincent documented what he could from his concealed position. But as dawn approached, he faced a terrible choice. He could retreat and report what he'd witnessed, knowing that by the time authorities responded, the evidence would be gone. Or he could intervene directly, risking his own life to save people who were being hunted like animals. The decision was made for him when one of the human targets stumbled into his hiding position. A young woman, probably in her 20s, bleeding from multiple wounds, and barely conscious from exhaustion and terror. She'd been running through the forest all night, pursued by people who viewed her life as entertainment. Vincent pulled the woman into his concealment and tried to assess her condition. She'd been shot in the leg, apparently with a weapon designed to wound rather than kill immediately. The hunters wanted their prey mobile enough to provide sport, but handicapped enough to ensure eventual capture. As Vincent worked to stabilize the woman's condition, he could hear the hunting party getting closer. Radio chatter indicated they were using tracking dogs and thermal imaging to follow the blood trail. It would only be a matter of minutes before they discovered Vincent's position. Vincent made the only decision he could live with. He activated his emergency beacon and called for immediate backup, then prepared to defend the injured woman against people who had the advantage of numbers, superior firepower, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything in Vincent's law enforcement training. The hunters weren't common criminals who would surrender when faced with legal authority. They were professionals who viewed Vincent as simply another obstacle to overcome. The first hunter to reach Vincent's position was carrying a crossbow and wearing night vision equipment. He moved with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance, clearly not anticipating that a park ranger would be protecting his prey. Vincent shot him twice in the chest with his service weapon. The man went down hard, but Vincent could hear others moving through the forest, coordinating their approach through radio communications. These people weren't going to be deterred by the death of one of their own. What followed was a running gun battle through the Specimen Ridge wilderness that lasted until sunrise. Vincent, carrying the wounded woman, was pursued by at least 6 armed hunters who were determined to eliminate any witnesses to their activities. The hunters had superior equipment and training, But Vincent knew the terrain and had the advantage of fighting for something more important than sport. The rescue helicopter that responded to Vincent's emergency beacon arrived to find him and the woman barricaded in a rocky outcrop, surrounded by the bodies of 4 hunters who had underestimated the determination of someone protecting an innocent life. The surviving hunters had vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind enough evidence to reveal the scope of their operation. But the investigation that followed was anything but straightforward. The dead hunters carried no identification, and their fingerprints weren't in any law enforcement database. Their equipment was military grade, but bore no markings that would identify its source. The vehicles they'd used were registered to shell companies that led nowhere. Most disturbing was the response from Vincent's own superiors. Instead of launching a massive investigation into human hunting operations, District Ranger Brennan seemed more concerned with controlling information and limiting the scope of the inquiry. "This is a federal matter now," she told Vincent during his debriefing. "The FBI is taking over the investigation. Your job is to write a report about encountering armed poachers and defending yourself. Nothing more." Vincent protested that the operation he'd witnessed was far more serious than simple poaching, but Brennan cut him off. "Vincent, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's possible that stress and adrenaline may have affected your perception of events. I think it would be best if you took some administrative leave while we sort this out." The woman Vincent had saved was taken to a secure medical facility where she was treated for her injuries. But when Vincent tried to follow up on her condition, he was told that she'd been transferred to federal custody and was no longer accessible to local law enforcement. The FBI agents who took over the case were professional, but clearly uninterested in pursuing the human hunting angle of Vincent's report. They treated the incident as a case of armed poachers who had escalated to violence when confronted by law enforcement. The evidence that Vincent had documented, photographs, recordings, physical evidence from the hunting camps, was classified as part of an ongoing investigation and removed from local custody. Vincent was placed on administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation and fitness for duty assessment. The evaluation, conducted by a psychologist who specialized in law enforcement trauma, concluded that Vincent was suffering from post-traumatic stress that had affected his ability to accurately perceive and recall events. Ranger Drake experienced a life-threatening situation that involved extreme violence, the psychologist's report stated. It's not uncommon for individuals in such circumstances to develop elaborate explanations for traumatic events that seem to make more sense than the simple reality of random violence. The report recommended extended leave and counseling, with the possibility of reassignment to duties that didn't involve high-stress field work. Vincent recognized it as a professional burial, a way to sideline him without having to address the substance of his claims. But Vincent wasn't willing to let the matter drop. During his forced leave, he conducted his own investigation into the Specimen Ridge incident. What he discovered convinced him that the human hunting operation he'd witnessed was part of a much larger network that operated with official protection. Vincent learned that similar incidents had been reported at other national parks across the western United States, always involving mysterious disappearances in areas that had been closed to public access for various official reasons. The patterns were consistent with organized hunting operations that targeted vulnerable individuals who could vanish without generating significant law enforcement attention. Vincent also discovered financial connections between his supervisor, Carol Brennan, and private security companies that specialized in adventure tourism for wealthy clients. Brennan had received consulting fees and other payments from these companies over several years, creating obvious conflicts of interest that had never been disclosed. Most disturbing was Vincent's discovery that the psychological evaluation that had sidelined him was conducted by a psychologist who was on retainer to the same private security companies that had been paying Brennan. The entire process of discrediting his account and removing him from the investigation had been orchestrated by people who had financial interests in protecting the human hunting operation. Vincent compiled his evidence and prepared to take it to federal authorities who weren't connected to the local network of corruption. But before he could act, he received a visit that made clear the risks he was facing. Two men came to his apartment on a cold November evening, identifying themselves as private investigators working for a law firm that represented various government contractors. They were polite but clear about the purpose of their visit. "Mr. Drake," one of them said, "we understand you've been conducting some unofficial research into matters that don't concern you. This research has the potential to interfere with ongoing federal investigations and compromise national security operations." The men showed Vincent documents that indicated the Specimen Ridge operation was part of a classified anti-terrorism training program. According to their explanation, the people Vincent had believed were victims were actually paid volunteers participating in realistic survival training exercises. The individuals you encountered were role-playing as refugees or escaped prisoners, they explained. The exercises are designed to train security personnel in tracking and apprehension techniques that might be needed in actual operations. Vincent pointed out that the woman he'd rescued had been genuinely injured and terrified, clearly not participating in any voluntary exercise. The men dismissed his concerns as misunderstanding based on the realistic nature of the training. "These exercises are designed to be as realistic as possible," they said. "Participants use makeup and special effects to simulate injuries. They're trained to maintain their roles even when encountering unexpected situations like park rangers." The explanation was plausible enough to create doubt, but Vincent remained convinced that what he'd witnessed was real human hunting, not training exercises. The men seemed to sense his skepticism and shifted to a more direct approach. "Mr. Drake, you have a choice to make," one of them said. "You can accept that you misunderstood what you witnessed and move on with your life. Or you can continue pursuing this matter and face the consequences of interfering with federal operations." They left Vincent with documents to sign acknowledging that he'd been briefed on the classified nature of the training exercises and agreeing to maintain confidentiality about what he'd witnessed. The documents included generous compensation for his inadvertent exposure to classified activities and assistance with career transition if he chose to leave the Park Service. Vincent signed the documents, but he had no intention of dropping his investigation. Over the following months, he continued gathering evidence about human hunting operations in national parks, building a case that he hoped to present to congressional investigators or independent journalists. But Vincent's investigation was cut short when he discovered that he was being actively surveilled. His phone calls were being monitored, his mail was being intercepted, and he was being followed by rotating teams of professionals who made no attempt to hide their presence. The message was clear. Vincent was being warned to stop his investigation or face more direct consequences. When he persisted, those consequences became reality. Vincent's apartment was burglarized, with his computer and all files related to the Specimen Ridge investigation stolen. His car was vandalized repeatedly, and he received anonymous phone calls threatening violence against him and anyone who helped him. The final straw came when Vincent discovered that someone had planted illegal drugs in his government vehicle, then called in an anonymous tip to park law enforcement. Vincent was arrested and charged with the drug possession and intent to distribute, charges that would have ended his career and sent him to prison. Only the intervention of a sympathetic prosecutor who recognized the planted evidence prevented Vincent from being railroaded into prison. The charges were dropped, but the message had been delivered. Stop investigating or face worse consequences. Vincent resigned from the Park Service in early 2022, officially citing health reasons but privately acknowledging that he could no longer effectively investigate crimes when the system itself was corrupted by the same people committing those crimes. He moved to Cook City, Montana, where he found work as a wilderness guide for tourists who wanted to experience Yellowstone's backcountry without the crowds of official tours. It was honest work that allowed him to stay in the wilderness he loved while avoiding the politics and corruption that had driven him from law enforcement. For 3 years, Vincent tried to put the Specimen Ridge incident behind him. He avoided reading news about missing persons cases, declined interviews with journalists, and refused to discuss his law enforcement career with anyone who asked. But the nightmares never completely stopped, and Vincent never stopped wondering what had happened to the other people who had been hunted in Specimen Ridge. How many had escaped? How many had died for the entertainment of wealthy psychopaths who viewed human life as just another trophy to be collected? Now, sitting across from investigative journalist Michael Torres, Vincent faced the decision of whether to break his silence and risk the consequences of exposing a network of human hunters who operated with official protection. "The woman you saved," Torres said, consulting his notes. "I've been trying to track her down for months. Official records show she was treated at a federal facility, then released into witness protection. But the people I've talked to think she might have been eliminated to prevent her from talking." Vincent felt a familiar chill. The woman whose life he'd saved might have been killed anyway, just more discreetly and with official sanction. If that was true, then everything he'd risked had been for nothing. "There's something else," Torres continued. "I've found evidence of similar operations in at least 12 other national parks across the country. Always the same pattern. Areas closed for official reasons, reports of unusual activity, missing persons who fit the profile of people who wouldn't be missed." Torres spread out a map of the United States with red circles marking the locations where he documented suspicious activity. The circles formed a network that spanned the entire western half of the country, suggesting a coordinated operation that involved enormous resources and high-level coordination. "Vincent, this isn't just about illegal hunting. This is about a systematic program to provide entertainment for wealthy sadists who have enough money and connections to buy immunity from prosecution. These people are literally getting away with murder because they have protectors in government agencies." Vincent studied the map and recognized several locations where he'd heard rumors of unusual disappearances or unexplained incidents. The scope of what Torres had uncovered was staggering. A nationwide network of human hunting operations protected by corruption at the highest levels. "What do you want from me?" Vincent asked. "I want you to go on record with what you witnessed at Specimen Ridge," Torres said. "I want you to help me connect the dots between the local corruption you uncovered and the national network I've been investigating. And I want you to help me find other victims and witnesses who can corroborate the story." Vincent considered the request, weighing the risks against the possibility of finally achieving justice for the people who had been hunted like animals in America's wilderness areas. The people who had threatened him 3 years earlier were still out there, still operating, still killing people for sport. "If we publish this story, they'll try to kill both of us," Vincent said. "These people have already demonstrated that they're willing to use violence to protect their operation. They have resources, connections, and no moral boundaries whatsoever." Torres nodded. "I've been investigating organized crime for 15 years, Vincent. I know the risks. But I also know that these people only have power because they operate in darkness. Shine enough light on them, and even their government protectors won't be able to shield them." Vincent thought about the woman he'd saved, wondering if she was still alive, or if her rescue had only delayed her death by a few months. He thought about all the other people who had been hunted in Specimen Ridge and similar locations across the country. how many had died screaming in the wilderness while wealthy psychopaths celebrated their kills. "All right," Vincent said finally. "I'll tell you everything I know. But we do this my way. We gather enough evidence to make the story bulletproof, and we release it simultaneously through multiple sources so they can't suppress it." Torres smiled and turned on his recorder. "Let's start with the night you first witnessed the human hunting operation. Tell me everything you remember, no matter how small the detail might seem." Outside the coffee shop, the blizzard continued to rage, but Vincent felt a different kind of storm building. For 3 years, he'd carried the secret of what he'd witnessed in Specimen Ridge. Now, finally, he was going to tell the truth about America's most exclusive hunting season, the season where the prey was human, and the hunters were protected by the very government agencies that were supposed to stop them. The story that emerged over the next 6 hours would change both their lives forever. But it would also expose a network of corruption and murder that reached from the wilderness of Yellowstone to the halls of power in Washington, D.C. By the time Vincent finished talking, Torres had filled 3 digital recorders with testimony that would shake the foundations of law enforcement agencies across the country. But both men knew that recording the story was only the beginning. The real challenge would be staying alive long enough to publish it. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Torres handed Vincent a card with an encrypted phone number. "From now on, we only communicate through secure channels," he said. "These people have been monitoring you for 3 years. They'll know we've been talking within hours." Vincent pocketed the card and looked out at the storm. Somewhere in the darkness, people were still being hunted for sport in America's wilderness areas. Soon, the world would know about it. But first, Vincent and Torres had to survive the inevitable response from people who had killed to keep their secrets hidden. The blizzard was ending, but a different kind of storm was just beginning. Park Ranger. Arthur Wallace never thought his geology background would lead him into the most dangerous discovery of his career. It was March 15th, 2018, 4 years before he would finally be able to tell anyone the truth about what lay buried beneath Big Bend National Park. Arthur was 42 years old, a career park ranger with 9 years of service and a master's degree in geological sciences that made him the go-to specialist for anything involving rocks, soil, or seismic activity. The winter of 2017 to 2018 had been brutal in the Chisos Mountains, with unprecedented snowfall that isolated large sections of the park for months. Arthur had been looking forward to the spring survey season, when he could finally investigate the unusual ground subsidence that had been reported near the old mining claims. The area had experienced minor seismic activity throughout the winter. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to warrant investigation of potential safety hazards for the thousands of visitors who would soon return to Big Bend. Arthur was working alone that morning, which was standard procedure for geological surveys in remote areas. The location was 8 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by a grueling hike through terrain that most visitors never saw. Weather conditions were perfect for fieldwork. Clear skies, mild temperature, and calm winds that wouldn't interfere with his sensitive measuring equipment. He was examining a large depression that had appeared after recent ground settling when he noticed something that made him stop and reconsider everything he thought he knew about Big Bend's geological history. What appeared to be natural rock formations showed clear evidence of artificial modification. Straight edges where there should have been irregular surfaces. Uniform patterns where nature should have created chaos. Geometric shapes that simply couldn't occur through natural processes. Arthur spent 30 minutes examining the formations before he realized what he was looking at: a camouflaged entrance to an underground structure. The camouflage was sophisticated beyond anything he'd seen in his geological career. using natural rock facings and carefully placed vegetation to blend seamlessly with the surrounding terrain. If not for the recent ground subsidence that had shifted some of the concealment materials, the entrance would have been completely invisible to anyone passing within feet of it. The entrance was secured by what appeared to be a standard mine safety gate, the kind used to keep tourists from wandering into dangerous abandoned shafts. But closer inspection revealed modern electronic locking mechanisms powered by a concealed solar panel array that was nearly invisible from ground level. This wasn't abandoned mining infrastructure. This was an active, maintained facility that someone had gone to enormous trouble to hide. Arthur tried to contact his supervisor via radio, but the topography of the Chisos Mountains created dead zones where communication was impossible. He was faced with the decision of returning to report the discovery, which would require a full day of hiking, or investigating the facility immediately while conditions were optimal. Given the potential safety implications for park visitors and the highly unusual nature of the discovery, Arthur decided to conduct a preliminary investigation. He recorded GPS coordinates with his handheld unit, photographed the entrance from multiple angles, and documented the electronic security measures with detailed notes about their apparent sophistication. The locking mechanism appeared to be malfunctioning, possibly due to the recent seismic activity or weather damage from the harsh winter. After 20 minutes of careful work, Arthur was able to bypass the electronic locks and open the entrance gate. The interior revealed a shaft descending at approximately 30 degrees, lined with modern concrete and equipped with electrical conduits and ventilation systems that hummed quietly with active power. Emergency lighting activated automatically as Arthur descended, indicating that the facility had active power systems despite its remote location and apparent secrecy. The shaft extended much farther than Arthur had expected, descending over 200 feet before opening into a large underground complex that defied all his expectations for what might exist beneath a national park. Arthur found himself standing in a reception area that looked more like a government office building than anything that should exist in the middle of the Chisos Mountains. The underground complex was vast, consisting of multiple levels connected by elevator systems and stairwells that descended even deeper into the earth. The construction was clearly military grade, with reinforced concrete walls, blast-resistant doors, and sophisticated air filtration systems that maintained perfect atmospheric conditions despite being buried under hundreds of feet of rock and soil. Emergency lighting provided adequate visibility throughout the facility, but many areas also had standard fluorescent lighting that could be activated by wall switches. Arthur moved carefully through the upper level, which appeared to be administrative and residential. He found offices equipped with modern computers and communication equipment, conference rooms with large wall displays, dormitory-style sleeping quarters with fresh linens, and a full kitchen facility stocked with food that had expiration dates only months away. Everything Arthur saw indicated that the facility was not only active, but regularly occupied by a significant number of people. Personal items were left on desks and tables, coffee makers contained fresh grounds, and refrigerators were stocked with perishable food. Someone had been here recently, and they clearly intended to return. Arthur descended to the middle level and found what appeared to be research laboratories equipped with scientific instruments he didn't recognize from his geological training. Multiple computer workstations were active, displaying data streams and monitoring various parameters in real time. Large wall displays showed maps of Big Bend National Park marked with colored zones and symbols whose meaning Arthur couldn't decipher, but which clearly indicated some kind of systematic survey or monitoring program. The laboratory spaces contained equipment for chemical analysis, biological research, and environmental monitoring that represented millions of dollars in sophisticated instrumentation. Sample storage areas contained thousands of specimens in carefully labeled containers, organized according to collection dates and locations that appeared to span multiple years and cover vast areas of the Southwest. Arthur examined some of the specimen labels and found samples collected from locations throughout Big Bend and other national parks across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. The scope of the collection suggested a research program that had been operating for many years, systematically gathering environmental data from federal lands across the region. The lower level was restricted by heavy security doors marked with biohazard and radiation warnings that made Arthur hesitate before attempting to gain access. Through reinforced windows, he could see additional laboratory spaces containing equipment that appeared to be analyzing substances under strict containment protocols. Workers in full protective suits were visible on security monitors, handling materials with extreme caution. Arthur found a computer terminal that wasn't password protected and began examining the files it contained. What he discovered made him realize that his accidental discovery had implications far beyond geological surveys or routine environmental monitoring. The facility was conducting research into environmental contamination that affected areas throughout the American Southwest. Contamination that appeared to be the legacy of atomic weapons testing conducted in the region during the 1940s and 1950s. The research documents Arthur found described contamination levels that exceeded federal safety standards by significant margins. Some areas of Big Bend contained radioactive materials at concentrations that posed immediate health risks to anyone with prolonged exposure. The contamination wasn't limited to obvious sources like former weapons testing sites. It had spread through groundwater, wind patterns, and wildlife migration to affect areas hundreds of miles from the original contamination sources. Most disturbing were documents indicating that this contamination had been known to federal agencies for decades, but had been systematically concealed from public health authorities and park visitors. The research facility Arthur had discovered was part of a much larger program designed to monitor and study the contamination while preventing public awareness that could create political and financial liability for the government agencies responsible. Arthur spent hours examining the research data, growing increasingly alarmed at what he was learning. The contamination wasn't just affecting rocks and soil. It was causing genetic mutations in wildlife, altering plant growth patterns and creating environmental conditions that could affect human health in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years or decades after exposure. The research facility was documenting these effects in detail, but the research was being conducted in complete secrecy. Park visitors were being exposed to dangerous levels of environmental contamination without any warning or protection. Worse, the contamination was spreading, carried by natural processes to areas that were increasingly popular with tourists and outdoor enthusiasts. Arthur was so absorbed in examining the research data that he didn't immediately notice the sound of elevator machinery activating in other parts of the facility. By the time he realized that people were entering the complex, it was too late to make an immediate exit. Arthur concealed himself in a storage area and watched through security camera monitors as facility personnel returned from whatever outside activities had kept them away. 3 individuals in civilian clothing entered the facility, followed by 2 people in military uniforms that Arthur didn't recognize. They moved through the complex with obvious familiarity, checking equipment and reviewing data on computer workstations. Their conversations, which Arthur could partially overhear through the ventilation systems, were alarming in their casual discussion of environmental hazards and public safety risks. The conversation fragments Arthur heard made clear that the facility personnel were fully aware of the health risks posed by environmental contamination, but were primarily concerned with preventing public awareness rather than protecting public health. They discussed containment strategies and information management in ways that made clear their priority was secrecy rather than safety. Most concerning was a discussion about eliminating security risks and addressing unauthorized discoveries. The facility personnel were clearly aware that someone had accessed the complex without authorization, and were taking steps to identify and neutralize what they viewed as a security breach. Arthur remained hidden for over 2 hours while the personnel conducted their activities. During this time, he overheard enough information to understand that the facility was part of a much larger network of secret research installations operating at national parks and federal lands across the country. The scope of the program was national, involving dozens of sites and hundreds of personnel. The research being conducted wasn't just passive monitoring. It included active experimentation designed to understand how environmental contamination could be managed and controlled. Some of the experiments involved deliberately introducing additional contaminants to study their interaction with existing contamination, potentially making the environmental hazards even worse. When the facility personnel finally left, Arthur waited an additional hour before beginning his own exit from the complex. However, he discovered that his original entrance route had been secured with new locks that he couldn't bypass from the inside. The facility personnel had clearly identified his access point and taken steps to prevent its future use. Arthur was forced to find an alternative exit, which led him through additional areas of the facility he hadn't previously explored. These areas contained evidence of research activities that were even more disturbing than what he'd already discovered. The facility was conducting biological research on tissue samples taken from wildlife and vegetation that had been exposed to contamination, documenting the genetic changes and health effects in detail. Some of the research involved human tissue samples, suggesting that facility personnel were studying the health effects of contamination exposure on people who visited or worked in affected areas. The research was being conducted without the knowledge or consent of the individuals whose tissue had been sampled, raising serious ethical and legal questions about the entire program. Arthur finally located a secondary exit that emerged nearly a mile from his original access point, concealed beneath what appeared to be natural rock formations that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for them. The sophistication of the concealment made clear that enormous resources had been devoted to keeping the facility secret from park visitors, park employees, and the general public. Arthur returned to park headquarters and immediately requested a meeting with his supervisor, Chief Ranger Patricia Morrison. Her reaction to his report was unexpected and deeply concerning. Rather than expressing alarm about an unauthorized facility operating on park lands, Morrison seemed primarily concerned about Arthur's unauthorized investigation of what she termed a classified federal installation. Morrison informed Arthur that the facility was operated by federal agencies under appropriate legal authority, and that his unauthorized access constituted a serious security breach that could result in federal charges. When Arthur expressed concerns about potential health and safety implications for park visitors, Morrison dismissed his worries as unfounded and outside his area of expertise. Morrison instructed Arthur to write a brief incident report describing his discovery of an abandoned mining structure that would be marked for visitor safety purposes. She specifically instructed him not to mention the active research facility or the environmental contamination he had documented, characterizing these observations as misunderstandings based on his lack of security clearance. Arthur protested that his observations clearly indicated environmental hazards that posed risks to public health, but Morrison was firm in her instruction to limit his report to basic safety concerns about unstable mining structures. She made clear that any attempt to discuss classified information with unauthorized personnel would result in immediate termination and federal prosecution. Within 48 hours of Arthur's report to Morrison, he was contacted by federal agents who identified themselves as representatives of the Department of Energy's Office of Security and Emergency Operations. Agents Sarah Martinez and Robert Thompson conducted an extensive debriefing about Arthur's unauthorized access to the underground facility. The agents explained that the facility was part of a classified environmental monitoring program related to historical nuclear weapons testing conducted in the region. According to their explanation, the research was authorized under various federal statutes and conducted with appropriate safety oversight, despite the secrecy that surrounded the program. Agent Martinez told Arthur that the contamination levels in the region were well within acceptable limits for public safety, and that the monitoring program was designed to ensure that these levels remained stable over time. The secrecy was necessary to prevent public panic about environmental hazards that were being appropriately managed by federal agencies. Agent Thompson added that Arthur's concerns about public health were noted and appreciated, but were based on incomplete information about the research program and its safety protocols. The agents required Arthur to sign extensive confidentiality agreements, acknowledging his exposure to classified information and agreeing not to disclose details of the facility or research operations under penalty of federal prosecution. The confidentiality agreements also included provisions that effectively made Arthur an unpaid informant for the federal agencies operating the facility. He was required to report any unusual environmental observations during his normal park duties and to provide regular updates about visitor activities in areas near the classified installation. Arthur signed the agreements because he had no realistic alternative, but he was deeply troubled by what he had learned about environmental contamination and the systematic efforts to conceal it from the public. Over the following months, he found himself paying increased attention to environmental conditions throughout Big Bend, looking for evidence of the contamination effects he had seen documented in the facility. What Arthur discovered during his expanded environmental monitoring was deeply alarming. Wildlife in areas near the underground facility showed behavioral abnormalities and physical changes that were consistent with chronic exposure to environmental toxins. Plants exhibited unusual growth patterns and characteristics that didn't match normal species classifications for the region. Water sources that should have been pristine contained chemical compounds that weren't naturally occurring, and soil samples showed contamination signatures that matched the patterns Arthur had seen in the facility's research data. Most disturbing was evidence that these environmental changes were expanding beyond the immediate area of the facility, suggesting that contamination was spreading through natural processes. Arthur reported these observations to Agents Martinez and Thompson as required by his confidentiality agreements, but their responses became increasingly evasive over time. Rather than expressing concern about spreading contamination, they began pressuring Arthur to limit the scope of his environmental monitoring activities. The agents provided Arthur with specific coordinates for his monitoring work, effectively directing his attention away from areas where environmental problems were most severe. Arthur realized that his reports were being used to help the federal agencies understand the extent of contamination spread, but not to develop solutions or protect public health. By late 2018, the environmental changes Arthur was observing had become so severe that he could no longer justify remaining silent. Wildlife mortality rates were increasing in affected areas. Vegetation showed widespread signs of contamination exposure, and water sources were becoming unsuitable for human consumption or wildlife habitat. Arthur began conducting unauthorized environmental sampling, collecting specimens for analysis by independent laboratories. The results confirmed his worst fears about contamination levels that far exceeded federal safety standards. Some areas of Big Bend contained radioactive materials and toxic chemicals at concentrations that posed immediate health risks to anyone with prolonged exposure. Arthur presented this evidence to Chief Ranger Morrison and demanded immediate action to protect public health by restricting access to contaminated areas and warning visitors about potential hazards. Morrison's response made clear that Park Service leadership was not only aware of the contamination, but was actively participating in efforts to conceal it from the public. Morrison told Arthur that his unauthorized environmental sampling constituted interference with classified federal operations and potential espionage against government agencies. She initiated disciplinary procedures that questioned Arthur's fitness for continued employment and reassigned him to administrative duties that kept him away from field work. The disciplinary action was accompanied by increased pressure from federal agents to cease his environmental monitoring activities. Agents Martinez and Thompson made clear that Arthur's continued employment and personal safety depended on his cooperation with federal directives to limit his investigations. Arthur was told that his concerns about environmental contamination were being addressed through appropriate federal channels, but that his continued interference with classified programs could result in criminal charges and imprisonment. The agents emphasized that Arthur's security clearance had been revoked, and that any future attempts to access classified information would be treated as federal crimes. The pressure campaign against Arthur escalated when his personal finances were subjected to intensive audit by the IRS. His professional reputation was systematically destroyed through negative performance evaluations, and his family began receiving anonymous threats that made clear the risks of continued resistance to federal demands for silence. Arthur realized that he was facing a choice between personal survival and his responsibility to protect public health from environmental hazards that were being systematically concealed. The federal agencies responsible for the contamination had enormous resources and legal authority that they were willing to use against anyone who threatened to expose their activities. In early 2019, Arthur made the difficult decision to resign from the National Park Service and relocate to an area where he could rebuild his life away from the federal agencies that viewed him as a threat to their operations. His resignation was accepted immediately, with Park Service leadership expressing relief that a problematic employee was no longer interfering with important federal programs. Before leaving Big Bend, Arthur made copies of all documentation related to his discoveries and arranged for it to be stored in secure locations. He also established contacts with environmental advocacy groups and investigative journalists who might be able to pursue the environmental contamination story if federal agencies took action against him. Arthur's departure from Big Bend didn't end his involvement with the environmental contamination issue, but it did limit his ability to document ongoing changes in areas he was no longer authorized to access. Through contacts with remaining park employees and independent researchers, Arthur continued to monitor reports of environmental problems that matched the patterns he had documented. The underground research facility that Arthur discovered continues to operate, presumably conducting research that prioritizes information control over public safety. The environmental contamination that Arthur documented has likely worsened in the years since his departure, but no independent monitoring is permitted to verify current conditions. Environmental advocacy groups have attempted to investigate contamination at Big Bend and similar federal installations, but they face the same obstacles Arthur encountered: classification restrictions, federal agency stonewalling, and systematic efforts to discredit anyone who raises public health concerns. Investigative journalists have documented similar patterns at other national parks, but their reports receive limited media coverage and generate little sustained public attention. The environmental contamination that threatens millions of park visitors continues to be concealed behind classification barriers and national security claims that prevent meaningful oversight or accountability. Arthur's exposure to contaminated environments during his time at Big Bend has had lasting effects on his health that continue to worsen over time. Medical examinations have revealed cellular damage consistent with radiation exposure, and he experiences symptoms that physicians believe are related to toxic chemical exposure from his time investigating the contamination. Medical specialists have confirmed that Arthur was exposed to radioactive isotopes and chemical compounds that are not found in naturally occurring environmental contamination. The specific combination of substances found in his system is consistent with exposure to materials used in weapons manufacturing and testing during the Cold War era. Arthur's physicians have advised him that the health effects of his exposure will likely be progressive and may significantly shorten his life expectancy. The same contamination that has affected Arthur's health has been affecting park visitors and wildlife at Big Bend for years, but no efforts are being made to warn the public or provide medical monitoring for potentially affected individuals. Arthur now lives under an assumed name in a remote location, continuing to monitor environmental conditions and advocate for public disclosure of contamination hazards on federal lands. His story represents just one example of how environmental contamination from historical military activities continues to threaten public health while being systematically concealed by the federal agencies responsible for creating the problems. The underground research facility beneath Big Bend National Park represents one node in a nationwide network of classified installations that monitor environmental contamination while preventing public awareness of the health risks involved. These facilities continue to operate with virtually no oversight, conducting research that prioritizes secrecy over safety and agency protection over public health. Arthur's discovery of the facility and his subsequent persecution by federal agencies illustrates how environmental crimes can be concealed through classification systems and national security claims that prevent accountability even when public health is at stake. The American people continue to visit national parks without knowledge of environmental hazards that could affect their health for years or decades after exposure. The story of Arthur Wallace and his discovery beneath Big Bend National Park remains largely unknown, buried beneath layers of classification and institutional secrecy that protect federal agencies from accountability for their environmental crimes. But the contamination continues to spread, the health risks continue to grow, and the cover-up continues to protect the agencies responsible, while sacrificing the health and safety of the American people who trusted them to protect the nation's natural heritage. Park Ranger Raymond Callis had been working the backcountry of Death Valley National Park for 15 years without ever encountering anything he couldn't explain through natural causes or human stupidity. That changed on a sweltering September morning in 2022, when seismic monitors began recording something that would ultimately cost him his life. The readings had been coming in for 3 weeks, not the sharp jolts of natural earthquakes that were common in Death Valley's fault-riddled geology, but prolonged rhythmic vibrations that suggested machinery rather than seismic activity. The instruments were recording patterns that looked almost like industrial equipment, operating on regular schedules, 8 hours on and 8 hours off, with intensity levels that suggested heavy machinery operating deep underground. Raymond's background in geology made him the obvious choice to investigate the source of these unusual readings. At 48 years old, he'd seen every type of geological phenomenon Death Valley had to offer, from flash floods that carved new canyons overnight to ground subsidence that swallowed entire roads. But these seismic patterns were unlike anything in his experience. The keen wonder mine seemed like the logical starting point for his investigation. It had been one of the largest gold extraction operations in the region, active from 1903 to 1916, before being abandoned when easily accessible or deposits were exhausted. The mine entrance had been sealed with concrete and steel barriers in the 1970s for public safety, and the entire area was designated off-limits to visitors due to unstable structures and environmental hazards from decades of mining chemicals. Raymond approached the old mining area on foot, hiking across 6 miles of desert terrain that hadn't seen significant human activity in over a century. The September heat was brutal even by Death Valley standards, pushing 115 degrees with no shade and no breeze. He carried extra water and electrolytes, planning to spend the day taking seismic measurements and documenting any obvious changes to the sealed mine structures. What Raymond found when he reached the Keen Wonder site contradicted everything in the official records about the mine's abandonment. Fresh tire tracks crossed the desert hardpan made by heavy vehicles that had no business operating in a restricted area of a national park. The tracks led directly toward what should have been a sealed mine entrance, but the concrete and steel barriers that were supposed to be blocking access had been carefully removed with industrial cutting tools and stacked neatly to one side like temporary construction materials. The mine opening was clear and obviously active, with the unmistakable sounds of diesel generators, air circulation fans, and heavy earth-moving equipment echoing up from the depths. Raymond's portable seismic equipment confirmed what his ears were telling him. This was definitely the source of the unusual vibrations that had brought him to investigate. Raymond tried to contact park headquarters via radio, but the remote location and surrounding topography made communication impossible. He was faced with a decision that would haunt his remaining days: hike back for backup, which would require most of a day and might allow whatever illegal operation was underway to be dismantled and moved, or investigate the situation himself to gather intelligence about what appeared to be a major violation of federal law on park lands. The sounds coming from underground suggested that whoever was operating in the mine was using sophisticated equipment and had been working for some time. This wasn't a small-scale treasure hunting expedition or casual trespassing. Raymond was looking at evidence of a professional operation that had invested significant resources in whatever they were doing beneath the desert. Raymond decided to investigate, a choice that would ultimately lead to his death 2 years later from radiation-induced organ failure. The mine entrance led to a cable platform system that looked like it had been installed within the past few months. Modern equipment with professional installation that bore no resemblance to century-old mining infrastructure. The cables descended into darkness beyond the reach of Raymond's powerful LED flashlight, but he could see that the mine shaft had been reinforced with new timber and equipped with modern safety systems that probably cost more than Raymond's annual salary. As Raymond prepared to descend into the mine, he could hear voices echoing up from the depths. Multiple people were working below, coordinating the operation of heavy machinery. From their conversations, it was clear this wasn't a temporary operation. They were discussing shift schedules, supply deliveries, and production quotas that indicated a long-term, well-funded project. Raymond began his descent on the cable platform, which operated with a motorized winch system that lowered him smoothly into the mine shaft. As he descended, he passed multiple levels of tunnel openings that had been carved out of the rock with modern equipment. The old mine workings had been expanded significantly, with new passages extending in directions that hadn't been explored by the original 19th century mining operation. At the bottom of the shaft, Raymond found himself in a vast underground complex that bore little resemblance to historical mining operations he'd studied. Modern LED lighting illuminated excavation areas that extended far beyond the original mine boundaries. Heavy machinery filled the space: bulldozers, conveyor systems, and industrial-grade drilling equipment that belonged in major construction projects, not abandoned mine shafts. But what was being mined bore no resemblance to the gold ore that had originally attracted prospectors to this location. Raymond watched from concealment behind mining equipment as workers used specialized tools to extract what appeared to be some kind of crystalline material from newly carved tunnel walls. The crystals were unlike anything Raymond had encountered in 15 years of geological survey work. They emitted a faint luminescent glow and seemed to pulse with internal energy, as if they contained some kind of power source. The workers handling the crystal extraction were wearing full hazmat suits with independent breathing apparatus, suggesting that whatever they were mining posed significant health hazards. The extracted crystals were being placed in lead-lined containers and transported to a central processing area where sophisticated scientific equipment analyzed their properties. Raymond managed to observe the processing operation from his concealed position, watching workers subject the crystals to various tests using instruments that looked more like laboratory equipment than mining tools. They were measuring electrical conductivity, radiation levels, and chemical composition, recording results in detailed logs and transmitting data to computers that appeared to be connected to external networks. The scale of the operation was enormous. Raymond counted at least 30 workers operating in multiple shifts, supported by enough equipment and supplies to sustain operations for months or even years. This wasn't an illegal mining venture operated by local criminals. This was a research facility disguised as a mining operation, with resources and sophistication that suggested corporate or government backing. Raymond tried to photograph the activities he was witnessing, but the lighting conditions and his need to remain hidden limited what he could document. He managed to capture images of some equipment and the glowing crystals, though the photos would be difficult to interpret without context about what was actually happening in the facility. As Raymond continued his covert observation, he realized that the crystalline materials were found only in specific geological formations that hadn't existed when the mine was originally operated. The new tunnel systems had been excavated to follow veins of material that appeared to have formed relatively recently, possibly within the past few decades rather than the millions of years typical of natural mineral formation. This raised disturbing questions about what had caused these unusual materials to form. Natural geological processes typically operated over vast timescales, but the crystal formations appeared to be much more recent. Something had altered the underground geology of the area, creating deposits of materials that didn't exist in conventional mineralogy textbooks. Raymond began collecting samples of rock and soil from around the extraction sites, hoping to analyze them later and understand the geological processes that had created these strange formations. He also documented the locations where materials were being extracted, creating a mental map of the underground complex that showed how extensive the operation had become. During his covert investigation, Raymond discovered that the mining operation was connected to an even larger network of underground facilities. Tunnel systems led away from the main extraction areas toward what appeared to be processing and storage facilities for the extracted materials. The scope of the operation extended far beyond what could be seen from the main shaft. Following one of these tunnel systems, Raymond found himself in a vast underground warehouse where containers of crystalline materials were stored under carefully controlled environmental conditions. The warehouse was temperature and humidity controlled, with sophisticated monitoring equipment that tracked the condition of stored materials around the clock. The storage containers were labeled with codes and numbers that suggested a systematic inventory system, though Raymond couldn't decipher the meaning of the markings. Some containers bore radiation warning labels, while others carried biohazard symbols or classifications that Raymond didn't recognize from his geological training. In the warehouse area, Raymond overheard conversations between supervisory personnel that provided disturbing insights into the scope and purpose of the operation. The extracted materials were apparently being shipped to multiple locations across the country, suggesting that Death Valley was just one extraction site in a much larger research or commercial program. The supervisors discussed production quotas and delivery schedules that indicated the operation was under pressure to extract large quantities of materials within specific timeframes. They also mentioned other extraction sites in different states, confirming that similar operations were being conducted in multiple locations throughout the American West. Raymond realized he had stumbled onto evidence of a coordinated program to extract and study materials that had unusual properties and potentially dangerous applications. The secrecy surrounding the operation, combined with the health protection measures he'd observed, suggested that the research was being conducted without proper oversight or safety protocols. As Raymond prepared to leave the underground complex and report what he had discovered to federal authorities, his investigation was cut short by facility security personnel who had apparently been tracking his movement through surveillance systems he hadn't detected. Armed guards in military-style clothing detained Raymond and escorted him to a command center where he was questioned by supervisory personnel about his unauthorized access to the facility. The interrogation revealed that Raymond had stumbled onto what his captors claimed was a classified research program operating under federal authorization. The facility commander, a man who identified himself only as Colonel Shaw, showed Raymond documents indicating that the extraction operation was part of a national security program designed to study materials that had strategic importance for defense applications. Colonel Shaw explained that the crystalline materials had been discovered in multiple locations across the American West, always in areas that had been exposed to atomic weapons testing or nuclear accidents during the Cold War era. The unusual substances appeared to be the result of radiation exposure interacting with specific geological conditions, creating materials that had properties not found in naturally occurring minerals. According to Shaw's explanation, the crystals could store and release energy at densities that made current battery and power storage technology look primitive. They also had potential applications in advanced electronics and possibly in propulsion systems that could revolutionize transportation and energy production. Raymond was told that his unauthorized discovery of the facility had compromised operational security, and that he would need to cooperate with federal investigators to assess the potential damage. Shaw presented Raymond with documents to sign acknowledging his exposure to classified information and binding him to maintain confidentiality about what he had witnessed under penalty of federal prosecution. But as Raymond reviewed the authorization documents, he noticed discrepancies that suggested the operation might not be as legitimate as Colonel Shaw claimed. The paperwork bore letterheads from private defense contractors rather than official government agencies, and some of the legal language seemed designed to protect corporate interests rather than national security. Raymond also observed that none of the facility personnel wore official military identification or government badges. Their equipment and clothing were high quality, but bore no official markings that would identify them as federal employees or military personnel operating under government authority. When Raymond questioned these discrepancies, Colonel Shaw's demeanor changed from professional cooperation to barely concealed hostility. Shaw made it clear that people who compromise national security programs like this one tend to have very short careers, and sometimes very short lives. Raymond realized he was being threatened, and that the operation he had discovered might not be authorized by any legitimate government agency. The extraction of unusual materials from federal lands, combined with direct threats against anyone who discovered the operation, suggested that private corporate interests were conducting illegal activities under the false pretense of national security research. Raymond signed the documents Shaw presented because he had no realistic alternative, but he had no intention of honoring confidentiality agreements that might be covering up illegal activities. As soon as he was released from the facility, he planned to report what he had discovered to federal law enforcement agencies that could investigate whether the operation had legitimate authorization. But Raymond's release from the facility didn't happen as he had expected. Instead of being escorted back to the surface and allowed to return to his normal duties, Raymond was taken to underground living quarters and informed that he would be staying at the facility until security assessments could be completed by unspecified federal authorities. Raymond found himself housed with other people who appeared to be unwilling guests at the facility. Some were researchers and technical specialists who claimed they had been recruited to work on the project with promises of high-paying positions, but were now prevented from leaving the facility. Others were local residents or federal employees who had discovered evidence of the operation and been detained to prevent them from reporting what they had seen to outside authorities. Dr. Nancy Pierce, a geologist who had been working at the facility for over 6 months, explained to Raymond how the detention system operated. The facility operators recruited specialists with attractive job offers and promises of important scientific work. But once people were inside the complex, they discovered they couldn't leave until the project was completed. The operators claimed this was necessary for security reasons, but Dr. Pierce believed they were simply using forced labor to staff their illegal operation. Dr. Pierce told Raymond the disturbing truth about the crystalline materials being extracted from the expanded mine workings. The substances were radioactive, but not in ways that showed up on standard radiation detection equipment. They emitted forms of energy that caused cellular damage in anyone exposed to them for extended periods, and the protective equipment provided to workers was inadequate to prevent health problems. According to Dr. Pierce, the workers extracting the materials were being systematically poisoned by their exposure to the crystals. People developed symptoms within weeks of starting work in the extraction areas, and the longer they were exposed, the worse their condition became. When workers became too sick to continue their duties, they were sent away from the facility to private medical facilities where their conditions could be monitored and treated without attracting attention from public health authorities. Dr. Pierce made it clear that the people running the operation had no concern for worker safety or environmental protection. They were under pressure to extract as much crystalline material as possible before someone discovered what they were doing, and they were willing to sacrifice the health and lives of anyone who got in their way or became a liability to the operation. Raymond realized that he was trapped in a situation where he could easily become one of those sacrificed workers. The facility operators had demonstrated they were willing to detain people indefinitely and expose them to dangerous materials without adequate safety protocols. His knowledge of the operation made him a security risk that they couldn't afford to allow to remain free. Over the following days, Raymond worked with Dr. Pierce and several other detainees to plan an escape from the underground facility. The security measures were extensive, with all official entrances and exits monitored by guards and electronic surveillance systems. Communication with the outside world was controlled by facility personnel, making it impossible to contact law enforcement authorities or family members. But Raymond discovered that the facility's security focused primarily on preventing people from leaving through the official exits they had used to enter the complex. The mining operation had created multiple tunnel systems that connected to natural cave formations, and some of these passages might provide alternative escape routes that bypassed the facility's security perimeter. Working with Dr. Pierce and 2 other detainees, Raymond began exploring the abandoned sections of the original mine workings that weren't being used by the current extraction operation. They found passages that led to natural cave systems extending beyond the facility's security perimeter, offering potential routes to the surface that wouldn't be monitored by facility personnel. The escape attempt was complicated by dangerous conditions in the abandoned mine workings. Many passages were structurally unsound and could collapse without warning. Others contained toxic gases or contaminated water from decades of mining operations that had left behind chemical residues. The group had to move carefully to avoid detection by facility security while also avoiding environmental hazards that could kill them. After several days of careful exploration, Raymond and his companions found a passage that led to a natural cave system extending toward the surface. The route was narrow and difficult to navigate, requiring them to crawl through spaces barely large enough for adult humans, but it offered their only realistic chance of escaping the facility without being detected by security personnel. The escape itself was harrowing. The passage was barely large enough for adult humans to crawl through, and several sections were partially flooded with contaminated water that had been polluted by decades of mining chemicals and more recent industrial activities. The group had to move slowly and quietly to avoid detection, while also dealing with unstable rock formations and toxic air quality that made breathing difficult. Raymond emerged from the cave system after more than 12 hours of underground travel, exhausted and contaminated with mining chemicals, but finally free from the illegal facility. He immediately drove to the nearest location where he could get reliable cell phone service and contacted federal law enforcement agencies to report what he had discovered. But when FBI agents investigated Raymond's claims, they found that the mining facility had been completely abandoned and dismantled. All equipment had been removed, tunnel systems had been collapsed and sealed, and there was no evidence of the extensive operation Raymond described. The site looked like nothing more than an old mine that had been briefly disturbed by treasure hunters or vandals. The federal agents found traces of recent industrial activity in the area, but nothing that proved the existence of the sophisticated research facility Raymond claimed to have witnessed. Without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses to support his account, the FBI couldn't pursue criminal charges against the people Raymond claimed were operating the illegal facility. Dr. Pierce and the other detainees Raymond had escaped with were never found. Federal investigators conducted searches based on Raymond's descriptions, but none of the people he claimed to have met in the facility could be located. Their absence suggested they had either been moved to other locations or eliminated to prevent them from corroborating Raymond's story about the underground operation. Raymond was subjected to extensive medical examinations to assess his exposure to hazardous materials during his time in the facility. The tests revealed contamination with radioactive substances that weren't found in naturally occurring mineral formations, supporting his claims about exposure to unusual crystalline materials during his underground detention. But the medical evidence wasn't sufficient to prove the existence of the illegal research operation Raymond described. The radioactive contamination could potentially be explained by exposure to residual materials from historical atomic weapons testing in the region, which had left radioactive deposits throughout areas of Nevada and California that were downwind from nuclear test sites. Raymond continued working as a park ranger, but he was reassigned to administrative duties in areas far from the former mining regions of Death Valley. His supervisors claimed the reassignment was routine career development, but Raymond understood it was designed to keep him away from areas where he might discover evidence of other illegal operations or continue investigating the facility he claimed to have found. Raymond's experience at the underground facility had lasting effects on his health that became more serious over time. He developed respiratory problems and chronic fatigue symptoms that were consistent with radiation exposure, though medical specialists couldn't determine the exact cause of his condition or develop effective treatments for his deteriorating health. Over the following months, Raymond conducted his own research into similar incidents at other national parks and federal lands throughout the western United States. He found reports of unusual seismic activity, unauthorized industrial operations, and mysterious illnesses affecting people who worked in remote areas of public lands, suggesting that the Death Valley operation might not have been unique. The patterns Raymond documented suggested that similar illegal extraction activities were being conducted in multiple locations, harvesting materials that had been created by decades of nuclear testing and accidents during the Cold War era. Private companies appeared to be systematically exploiting federal lands to obtain substances that could have enormous commercial and military value, while exposing workers and nearby communities to dangerous levels of radiation. Raymond tried to contact other Park Service personnel who might have witnessed similar operations, but most were reluctant to discuss their experiences or had been transferred to different positions after reporting unusual activities. Those who were willing to talk described encounters with unauthorized research operations, threats from private security personnel, and pressure from supervisors to ignore evidence of illegal activities on federal lands. Raymond realized that the Park Service and other federal land management agencies were either unable or unwilling to stop illegal extraction operations that were being conducted by companies with extensive resources and high-level political connections. The organizations responsible for these activities had enough influence to operate with virtual impunity, even when conducting dangerous operations on protected federal lands. The health problems affecting Raymond continued to worsen throughout 2023, with physicians documenting progressive cellular damage that they believed was caused by exposure to exotic radioactive materials. Medical specialists confirmed that Raymond had been exposed to isotopes and chemical compounds that weren't found in naturally occurring environmental contamination, but they couldn't identify effective treatments for his condition. Raymond documented his experiences in detailed reports that he shared with environmental advocacy groups and investigative journalists, hoping that public attention might force government agencies to investigate illegal activities on federal lands. But without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses, his accounts were generally dismissed as fabrications or delusions from someone suffering radiation-induced cognitive impairment. Raymond retired from the National Park Service in early 2024, his health too compromised to continue working in any capacity. He moved to a small town in Arizona, far from any federal lands or industrial operations, hoping that reduced environmental exposure might slow the progression of his condition and extend his remaining time. But Raymond's health continued to deteriorate rapidly, with multiple organ systems showing signs of failure consistent with long-term radiation exposure. His physicians informed him that the cellular damage was too extensive to be reversed, and that his life expectancy was likely measured in months rather than years. Raymond spent his final months documenting everything he could remember about the underground facility at Death Valley and the illegal extraction operation he had witnessed. He created detailed written accounts, recorded video testimonies, and compiled all available evidence about similar operations at other federal locations, hoping that future investigators might be able to use his documentation to expose the truth. Raymond Callis died on March 12, 2024, from multiple organ failure that medical examiners attributed to exposure to exotic radioactive materials of unknown origin. His death certificate listed the cause as complications from radiation syndrome, but provided no explanation for how a park ranger working in Death Valley could have been exposed to such dangerous levels of radioactive contamination. After Raymond's death, his sister found his detailed documentation about the underground facility and illegal extraction operation among his personal effects. She provided this information to congressional investigators who were examining federal land management practices, but no official investigation into the Death Valley incident was ever launched. The crystalline materials that Raymond witnessed being extracted from the Keen Wonder Mine represent a category of substances that exist only in areas contaminated by nuclear weapons testing and accidents. These materials have properties that make them extremely valuable for energy storage, advanced electronics, and potentially weapons applications, but their extraction and study is being conducted without oversight or safety protocols that would protect workers and the environment. Raymond's experience suggests that federal lands across the American West are being systematically exploited by private interests that operate beyond the reach of accountability or legal oversight. The illegal extraction operations are sophisticated and well-funded, with resources that allow them to operate in complete secrecy while eliminating anyone who threatens to expose their activities. The long-term consequences of these operations remain unknown because the secrecy surrounding them prevents any independent assessment of their environmental or health impacts. The extracted materials could lead to technological advances that benefit humanity, or they could be used for purposes that threaten global security, but the public will never have input into how these potentially revolutionary substances are utilized. Raymond's death represents just one casualty in operations that are affecting unknown numbers of people across multiple states. The same radioactive contamination that killed Raymond is likely affecting other workers, local residents, and park visitors who have no knowledge of the environmental hazards they're being exposed to during visits to what they believe are protected natural areas. Somewhere beneath the desert floor of Death Valley National Park, and in similar locations throughout the American West, private companies continue extracting materials that could change the world. But the extraction is being conducted in complete darkness, beyond the reach of oversight or accountability, and the costs are being paid by people who never consented to participate in these dangerous experiments. The deep places of the earth are giving up secrets that were buried by decades of nuclear weapons testing. But those secrets are being claimed by private interests that view human life and environmental protection as acceptable losses in pursuit of unprecedented profits. The full scope of what is being extracted and what is being done with these materials may never be known by the people who ultimately pay the price for these operations with their health, their lives, and their right to know what dangers lurk beneath the lands that belong to all Americans. Park Ranger Diane Castellanos had been protecting the wildlife at Glacier National Park in Montana for 11 years, when she discovered that some of the people she was supposed to trust with her life were the same people systematically destroying everything she'd dedicated her career to preserving. It was August 2020, during the peak of the summer visitor season, when Diane first noticed the patterns that would eventually lead her into the darkest investigation of her career. Glacier National Park was home to some of the most pristine wildlife habitat in North America. The park's 1 million acres of wilderness supported populations of grizzly bears, mountain goats, bighorn sheep, wolves, and dozens of other species that had been driven to extinction or near extinction in other parts of their historic ranges. For visitors and researchers from around the world, Glacier represented one of the last places on Earth where North American wildlife could be observed in truly natural conditions. Diane's assignment was the North Fork area, a remote section of the park that bordered the Canadian wilderness and saw relatively few visitors due to its difficult access and primitive facilities. The area was critical habitat for species that required large territories and minimal human disturbance, including grizzly bears and gray wolves that ranged across the international border. The first sign that something was wrong came during Diane's regular monitoring of wildlife populations in the restricted zones around the North Fork. These areas were closed to public access to protect critical breeding habitat, but Diane conducted monthly surveys to document population numbers and animal behavior patterns. During her July survey, Diane noticed that several radio-collared grizzly bears hadn't been detected in their usual territories for over 2 weeks. The bears were part of a long-term research study tracking population dynamics and movement patterns, so their absence was immediately concerning. Grizzly bears were creatures of habit, especially during salmon runs and berry season, so disappearing from prime feeding areas was unusual behavior. Diane expanded her search to areas outside the bears' normal territories, thinking they might have moved in response to food availability or human activity. What she found instead was evidence that the bears hadn't moved at all. They had been killed. In a remote meadow 15 miles from any official trail, Diane discovered the remains of a large adult grizzly bear that had been killed and butchered with professional efficiency. The hide had been removed expertly, along with the paws, skull, and other parts that were valuable in illegal wildlife trade. The carcass had been left to scavengers, but the kill was recent enough that Diane could determine the bear had been shot with a high-powered rifle. Most disturbing was the fact that the bear's radio collar was missing. Someone had known the bear was part of a research study and had deliberately removed the tracking device to prevent the kill from being detected through normal monitoring protocols. Diane documented the scene carefully and began searching for additional evidence. Within a quarter-mile of the bear kill, she found spent rifle cartridges from expensive hunting ammunition, boot prints from high-quality hiking boots, and the remains of a temporary camp that suggested the killers had been in the area for several days. The level of preparation and equipment suggested this wasn't opportunistic poaching. Someone had planned the operation carefully, using knowledge of bear behavior and research protocols to target specific animals without detection. The clean butchering and selective removal of valuable parts indicated involvement with organized wildlife trafficking networks. Diane reported her findings to park headquarters and requested an investigation by the service's Law Enforcement Division. But the response she received was puzzling and ultimately disturbing. Instead of launching an immediate investigation, her supervisors seemed more concerned with preventing publicity than catching the people responsible. "We need to handle this carefully," her supervisor, Chief Ranger Lawrence Morrison, told her during their meeting. "Poaching incidents can damage the park's reputation and affect visitor numbers. We don't want to create panic or suggest that our wildlife protection efforts are inadequate." Diane was instructed to continue her normal duties while law enforcement specialists conducted their investigation. But weeks passed without any apparent progress, and when Diane requested updates on the case, she was told that the investigation was ongoing, but that she shouldn't expect immediate results. Meanwhile, Diane's monthly wildlife surveys continued to reveal disturbing trends. More radio-collared animals were disappearing from the restricted areas, and she began finding evidence of additional kills throughout the North Fork region. Mountain goats, bighorn sheep, and wolves were being systematically hunted and butchered by people who seemed to have detailed knowledge of the park's wildlife management programs. In September, Diane made a discovery that fundamentally changed her understanding of the situation. While investigating the disappearance of a pack of gray wolves, she found a temporary hunting camp that had been recently abandoned. The camp was sophisticated, with military-grade equipment, expensive hunting gear, and communication devices that suggested coordination with outside parties. Among the equipment left behind, Diane found a GPS unit that contained waypoints marking the locations of radio-collared animals throughout the park. The waypoints were updated with current date and timestamps, indicating that someone was providing real-time tracking information to the hunters. Diane realized that the poaching operation wasn't just using publicly available information about wildlife locations. Someone with access to the park's research databases was feeding information directly to the hunters, allowing them to locate and target specific animals with precision. The GPS unit also contained waypoints for locations outside Glacier National Park, including coordinates for areas in Yellowstone, Grand Teton, and other major national parks across the western United States. The scope of the operation was much larger than Diane had imagined. This was a coordinated network that was operating in multiple protected areas. Diane downloaded the data from the GPS unit before reporting her discovery to park headquarters. She wanted to analyze the information herself before turning it over to investigators who had shown limited interest in pursuing the case aggressively. What Diane found in the GPS data was evidence of a systematic campaign to harvest trophy animals from America's national parks. The waypoints marked not just the locations of research animals, but also the sites where they had been killed and processed. The data showed that dozens of animals had been taken over the previous 2 years, all from restricted areas where hunting was absolutely prohibited. More disturbing was the discovery that some of the waypoints corresponded with official Park Service activities. Several kills had occurred during periods when park personnel were supposedly conducting research or maintenance activities in the same areas. The timing suggested that park employees were either directly involved in the poaching or providing cover for the operations. Diane realized she needed outside help to properly investigate what she was discovering. The scope of the operation and the possible involvement of Park Service personnel meant that normal internal channels might be compromised. Diane contacted Special Agent Carol Hendricks of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who specialized in investigating wildlife trafficking networks. Agent Hendricks had experience with cases involving organized poaching operations and the connections between illegal hunting and international wildlife trade. When Diane shared her findings with Agent Hendricks, the federal investigator immediately recognized the patterns as indicators of a high-end trophy hunting operation. What you're describing sounds like a service that caters to extremely wealthy clients who want access to animals they can't legally hunt, Agent Hendricks explained. These operations charge enormous fees, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, for the opportunity to hunt protected species in restricted areas. The clients get the thrill of taking truly rare trophies, while the operators make more money from a single kill than most poachers see in years of illegal activity. Agent Hendricks explained that such operations required extensive inside knowledge of park operations, animal behavior, and law enforcement protocols. They need people on the inside, she said, someone who can provide real-time information about animal locations, research activities, and ranger patrol schedules. Diane provided Agent Hendricks with copies of all the evidence she had collected, including the GPS data and photographs of the kill sites. Agent Hendricks initiated a federal investigation, but she warned Diane that the process would be complex and potentially dangerous. If Park Service personnel are involved, your safety could be at risk, Agent Hendricks warned. These operations protect themselves by eliminating threats, and that includes law enforcement officers who get too close to their activities. Agent Hendricks advised Diane to continue her normal duties while maintaining careful documentation of anything suspicious she observed. But Diane was also instructed to avoid conducting solo investigations or putting herself in situations where she might encounter the poaching operation directly. Despite these warnings, Diane felt compelled to continue investigating. The systematic destruction of wildlife in the park she had dedicated her career to protecting was something she couldn't ignore, even if pursuing the case put her at personal risk. Over the following weeks, Diane began paying closer attention to the activities of her colleagues and supervisors. If someone within the Park Service was providing information to poachers, she needed to identify who was involved and how they were accessing the data. What Diane discovered was a pattern of suspicious behavior that suggested the conspiracy reached higher levels of park management than she had imagined. Several supervisors had access to the research databases that contained animal tracking information, and their work schedules often correlated with periods when poaching activities occurred. Most suspiciously, Chief Ranger Lawrence Morrison had been discouraging aggressive investigation of the poaching incidents, while simultaneously having unusual knowledge of when and where new kills were being discovered. Morrison seemed to know about evidence before it was officially reported, and he consistently steered investigations away from areas where more evidence might be found. Diane began conducting her own surveillance of park personnel, documenting their activities and looking for connections to outside parties who might be involved in the poaching operation. What she found was evidence of a conspiracy that included not just park employees, but also local outfitters, wealthy hunters from across the country, and international wildlife traffickers. The operation worked by using Park Service employees to provide real-time information about animal locations and ranger activities. Wealthy clients would pay enormous fees for guided hunts in restricted areas, with the understanding that they were purchasing access to truly rare and protected species. The hunts were conducted during periods when normal park activities provided cover for the presence of armed personnel in restricted areas. Research activities, maintenance operations, and training exercises were used to justify the presence of people and vehicles in areas where poaching was occurring. Diane realized that Chief Ranger Morrison was not just aware of the poaching, he was coordinating it. His position gave him access to all research data, patrol schedules, and law enforcement activities. He could ensure that poaching operations occurred when they wouldn't be detected, and that any investigations would be ineffective or misdirected. But Morrison wasn't operating alone. The conspiracy included other park employees, local business owners, and what appeared to be organized crime figures who specialized in wildlife trafficking. The operation was sophisticated enough to move trophy materials internationally, serving clients who collected rare specimens from protected areas around the world. Diane documented her findings and prepared to share them with Agent Hendricks, but before she could make contact, she received a warning that changed everything. An anonymous note left in her ranger station warned her that her investigation had been detected and that her life was in danger. "You need to stop digging or you'll end up like the animals you're trying to protect," the note read. "Some hunts are more dangerous than others, and you're about to become the prey." Diane realized that the people involved in the poaching operation were aware of her investigation and were prepared to use violence to protect their activities. But instead of backing down, she decided to accelerate her efforts to expose the conspiracy. Working quickly, Diane compiled all her evidence and transmitted it to Agent Hendricks through encrypted channels that couldn't be monitored by Park Service personnel. She also created copies of all documentation and stored them in secure locations outside the park, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if something happened to her. Agent Hendricks responded immediately, informing Diane that federal law enforcement agencies were preparing to conduct coordinated raids on the poaching network. But the operation would take time to organize, and, in the meantime, Diane needed to maintain her normal activities while avoiding anything that might alert the conspirators. But the poachers had no intention of waiting for Diane to complete her investigation. 2 days after receiving the anonymous warning, Diane was conducting a routine patrol in the North Fork area when she was approached by 3 armed men who claimed to be conducting authorized research activities. The men, dressed in official-looking outdoor gear and carrying credentials that appeared legitimate, told Diane they were tracking a radio-collared grizzly bear for a university research project. They asked her to assist with their work by helping locate the bear and ensuring that no other park personnel interfered with their activities. Diane immediately recognized this as an attempt to use her to facilitate a poaching operation. The men were trying to get her to help them locate and kill a protected animal while providing them with cover from law enforcement detection. Diane pretended to cooperate while actually documenting the men's identities and activities. She provided false information about animal locations while secretly photographing the men and their equipment. She also activated a personal emergency beacon that would alert law enforcement to her location and situation. The situation escalated when one of the men realized that Diane wasn't actually helping them locate the bear. "You're not being very cooperative," he told her, while moving his hand toward the rifle he was carrying. "Maybe you need some encouragement to take this more seriously." Diane realized she was in immediate danger. The men weren't just poachers. They were enforcers who were prepared to use violence to protect the operation. She was alone in a remote area with no immediate backup, and the men clearly had no intention of allowing her to report their activities. Diane ran. Using her knowledge of the terrain and her superior physical conditioning, she evaded the armed men and made it to an area where her radio could reach park headquarters. But when she called for assistance, she discovered that Chief Ranger Morrison was coordinating the response to her emergency call. Morrison directed responding rangers away from Diane's actual location, claiming she had reported her position incorrectly. Meanwhile, the armed men who had threatened her were given accurate information about her location and movements, allowing them to continue pursuing her. Diane realized that Morrison was actively working to prevent her rescue, while enabling her attackers to locate and eliminate her. She was trapped in a situation where the normal emergency response systems had been compromised by the same conspiracy she was investigating. Using her emergency beacon, Diane was able to contact Agent Hendricks directly and request federal assistance. Agent Hendricks coordinated with FBI personnel to locate and rescue Diane, bypassing the compromised Park Service response system. Federal agents reached Diane before her attackers could locate her, but the armed men escaped into the wilderness before they could be apprehended. The rescue operation revealed the extent to which Park Service personnel had been compromised by the poaching conspiracy. Agent Hendricks used Diane's evidence to coordinate raids on the poaching network that resulted in arrests across multiple states. The investigation revealed that the operation had been active for over 5 years, generating millions of dollars in profits from illegal trophy hunting in national parks. Chief Ranger Morrison and several other Park Service employees were arrested on federal charges related to wildlife trafficking and conspiracy. The investigation also uncovered connections to organized crime figures and international wildlife smuggling networks that had been using American national parks as sources for rare specimens. But many aspects of the conspiracy were never fully exposed. Some of the wealthy clients who had paid for illegal hunts were never identified, and much of the money generated by the operation was never recovered. The international connection suggested that the American operation was part of a global network that probably continues to operate in other locations. The prosecution of the poaching network revealed details that shocked even experienced federal investigators. The operation had generated over $12 million in profits over 5 years, serving clients who paid between $200,000 and $800,000 for the opportunity to hunt protected species in restricted areas of national parks. The client list, when finally obtained through federal subpoenas, read like a directory of American wealth and political influence. Corporate executives, entertainment industry figures, foreign nationals, and even some elected officials had paid enormous sums for the thrill of hunting animals that existed nowhere else on Earth in their natural habitat. The operation was far more sophisticated than typical poaching rings. Clients were flown in on private aircraft to remote airstrips, transported to luxury hunting camps established in restricted areas, and provided with professional guides who had intimate knowledge of animal behavior and park operations. The hunts were conducted with military precision, using advanced equipment and communication systems to avoid detection. Agent Hendricks discovered that the poaching network had connections to similar operations in Africa, Asia, and South America, creating a global marketplace for wealthy individuals who viewed protected species as ultimate hunting challenges. The American operation was considered especially prestigious because it provided access to animals in areas that were supposed to be completely protected from human exploitation. The level of corruption within the National Park Service was more extensive than initially suspected. Morrison had recruited park employees at multiple levels, from maintenance workers who provided information about remote access routes to research scientists who shared real-time animal tracking data. The conspiracy included people who had worked for the Park Service for decades, building trusted relationships that made their betrayal particularly devastating. Dr. Arthur Brennan, the park's chief wildlife biologist, had been providing detailed information about animal behavior patterns, breeding cycles, and territory boundaries that allowed hunters to target the most valuable specimens. His research data was used to identify animals with the largest antlers, the most impressive physical characteristics, or the rarest genetic traits. Maintenance supervisor Beverly Patterson had been creating access routes for hunting vehicles by scheduling road maintenance activities that provided cover for transporting clients and equipment into restricted areas. Her knowledge of park infrastructure allowed the hunting operation to move people and materials without using official checkpoints or monitored access points. Even some seasonal employees had been recruited to serve as lookouts and communication relays, providing early warning when legitimate park personnel approached areas where hunting activities were taking place. The conspiracy had created a parallel command structure within the park that could coordinate illegal activities while maintaining the appearance of normal park operations. The investigation revealed that the poaching network had killed or captured over 200 protected animals over 5 years, including several species that were already endangered. The ecological impact was devastating, disrupting breeding populations and research programs that had been monitoring wildlife recovery for decades. Some of the animals killed were famous individuals that had been featured in documentaries and educational programs. A grizzly bear known as Old Blue, who had been followed by researchers for over 15 years, was found to have been killed for a client who wanted to add a celebrity bear to his trophy collection. The bear's radio collar and research records allowed the hunters to locate and kill an animal that had become a symbol of successful wildlife conservation. The loss of breeding animals was particularly damaging to species recovery efforts. Several female bears and wolves that had been documented as successful mothers were killed during critical periods when they were caring for young offspring. The deaths not only removed breeding individuals from the population, but also resulted in the loss of their offspring, compounding the ecological damage. The poaching network had also been selling live animals to private collectors and illegal wildlife dealers. Some rare species were captured rather than killed, transported to private facilities where they were held in captivity for wealthy individuals who wanted to own truly unique animals. The capture operations were particularly cruel, often involving the killing of mother animals to obtain their offspring. Agent Hendricks discovered evidence that some captured animals had been sold to overseas buyers who operated private hunting reserves where wealthy clients could hunt protected species in controlled environments. The American wildlife was being exported to facilities in countries with weak wildlife protection laws, where the animals would eventually be killed by hunters who wanted guaranteed access to rare North American species. The financial scope of the operation was staggering. Individual hunts generated between $200,000 and $800,000, depending on the species and the difficulty of the hunt. A grizzly bear hunt in a restricted area of Glacier National Park cost $400,000, while a wolf pack hunt that allowed clients to kill multiple animals cost $600,000. The most expensive hunts involved species that were on the endangered species list, with some clients paying over $1 million for the opportunity to kill animals that were critically endangered. The money was distributed through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that made it difficult for investigators to trace the financial flows. Morrison and other Park Service employees received monthly payments disguised as consulting fees or equipment purchases, while the primary organizers of the network kept the majority of the profits. The investigation also revealed that the poaching network had been using its profits to corrupt law enforcement officials and government regulators who might interfere with their operations. Bribes were paid to officials in multiple agencies to ensure that investigations would be ineffective or misdirected. Some officials were given free hunting trips or other benefits in exchange for their cooperation. The trial of the conspiracy members was complicated by the involvement of wealthy and politically connected individuals who had extensive legal resources. Several clients hired teams of expensive lawyers who argued that they had been deceived about the legality of the hunts, claiming they had been told the activities were authorized research or wildlife management operations. Some clients reached plea agreements that allowed them to avoid prison time in exchange for paying enormous fines and cooperating with ongoing investigations. But others fought the charges aggressively, using their wealth and connections to challenge evidence and delay proceedings. Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison after being convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, wildlife trafficking, and racketeering. Other Park Service employees received sentences ranging from 3 to 10 years, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with investigators. But the sentences were considered inadequate by many wildlife protection advocates who argued that the ecological damage caused by the poaching network would take decades to repair. The loss of breeding animals from already vulnerable populations had set back conservation efforts that had required years of careful management and scientific research. The corruption scandal devastated the national park, service's reputation, and led to extensive reforms in personnel screening and oversight procedures. New protocols were implemented to prevent unauthorized access to research data and animal tracking information. Background checks for park employees were expanded to include financial investigations that might identify people vulnerable to corruption. But the reforms came too late to prevent the damage that had already been done. The poaching network had operated for 5 years with virtual impunity, killing or capturing hundreds of protected animals while generating millions of dollars in profits. The conspiracy had turned America's most treasured wilderness areas into private hunting preserves for wealthy criminals. Diane's investigation had exposed one major poaching network, but it had also revealed how vulnerable America's protected wildlife was to organized criminal exploitation. The conspiracy had operated for years without detection, because it involved people who were supposed to be protecting the animals they were actually helping to destroy. The arrests and prosecutions that resulted from Diane's investigation were successful, but they came at enormous personal cost. Diane received death threats from unknown sources and was forced to relocate to a different state for her safety. Her career with the National Park Service was effectively ended by the investigation, as she could no longer trust the colleagues and supervisors she had worked with for years. The threats against Diane continued even after the prosecutions were completed. Anonymous messages warned her that the poaching network had connections to other criminal organizations that might seek revenge for her role in exposing the conspiracy. Federal marshals provided security for Diane during the trials, but long-term protection was impossible to maintain. Diane now works for a private wildlife conservation organization, but she continues to monitor illegal activities in national parks. Her experience taught her that wildlife protection requires vigilance not just against external threats, but against corruption within the agencies and organizations tasked with conservation responsibilities. The conservation organization Diane works for has documented similar patterns of wildlife trafficking in national parks across the country. The methods used by the Glacier National Park Network have been replicated in other locations, suggesting that organized wildlife crime is a growing threat to America's protected species. Reports from other parks describe the same patterns Diane had observed: the systematic disappearance of research animals, the involvement of park personnel in illegal activities, and the sophisticated operations that cater to wealthy clients who want access to protected species. The problem appears to be national in scope, involving multiple criminal networks that operate with similar methods and objectives. Agent Hendricks has continued investigating wildlife trafficking networks and has found evidence of connections between the Glacier operation and similar conspiracies in other countries. The global demand for rare wildlife trophies has created international criminal networks that share information, resources, and clients across national boundaries. The wealthy individuals who pay for illegal hunting experiences represent a market that spans multiple continents and includes people with enormous financial resources and political connections. These clients view protected species as ultimate status symbols, and their willingness to pay extraordinary prices for illegal hunting experiences ensures that criminal networks will continue to exploit vulnerable wildlife populations. The enforcement challenges are enormous. National parks cover millions of acres of remote wilderness where illegal activities can be conducted far from any oversight. The same characteristics that make these areas valuable for wildlife protection also make them ideal for criminal exploitation. The involvement of Park Service personnel in wildlife trafficking creates additional enforcement complications. When the people responsible for protecting wildlife are actually facilitating its destruction, normal oversight and accountability measures become ineffective. The corruption can spread throughout park organizations, creating networks of complicit employees who protect each other while exploiting the resources they are supposed to preserve. The international connections of wildlife trafficking networks create jurisdictional complications that make prosecution difficult. Evidence may be located in multiple countries, clients may be foreign nationals with diplomatic immunity, and profits may be hidden in financial systems that are beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The ecological consequences of organized wildlife trafficking extend far beyond the immediate loss of individual animals. The disruption of breeding populations and social structures can have cascading effects throughout ecosystems, affecting species recovery efforts and the balance of predator-prey relationships. The psychological impact on research scientists and wildlife biologists has been profound. Many researchers have dedicated their careers to studying and protecting specific animals, forming emotional connections to individual bears, wolves, and other species that they have monitored for years. Discovering that their research data has been used to facilitate the killing of these animals has been devastating for many scientists. Some researchers have left their careers entirely, unable to continue work that might inadvertently contribute to wildlife exploitation. Others have developed elaborate security measures to protect their data, but these precautions interfere with legitimate research collaboration and data sharing that are essential for effective wildlife management. The tourism industry in areas affected by wildlife trafficking has also suffered significant impacts. Many visitors come to national parks specifically to observe rare wildlife in natural settings. When animal populations are depleted by illegal hunting, the visitor experience is diminished and park revenues decline. Local communities that depend on wildlife-related tourism have been particularly affected. Guide services, hotels, restaurants, and other businesses that cater to wildlife enthusiasts have seen reduced demand as animal populations have declined, and visitors have become aware of the threats facing protected species. The psychological impact on legitimate park employees has been severe. Many rangers and other park personnel feel betrayed by colleagues who were secretly involved in wildlife trafficking while pretending to share conservation values. The atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that followed the exposure of the conspiracy has made normal park operations more difficult. Employee morale has been affected by the knowledge that anyone could potentially be involved in illegal activities. The comprehensive background checks and oversight measures implemented after the scandal have created an atmosphere where employees feel constantly monitored and suspected of potential wrongdoing. The legal precedents established by the Glacier prosecutions have been important for future wildlife protection efforts. The sentences imposed on the conspirators demonstrated that wildlife trafficking would be prosecuted aggressively, even when it involved government employees and wealthy clients with extensive legal resources. But the legal victories have not eliminated the underlying demand for illegal wildlife experiences. The wealthy individuals who create the market for these services continue to exist, and new criminal networks are likely to emerge to serve their demands. The enormous profits available from wildlife trafficking ensure that criminal organizations will continue attempting to exploit protected species. The reforms implemented by the National Park Service have improved security and oversight, but they cannot eliminate all vulnerabilities. The vast scale of America's national park system and the remote nature of many protected areas means that some level of criminal exploitation is probably inevitable. The challenge for wildlife protection agencies is to develop enforcement strategies that can detect and disrupt criminal networks before they can cause irreversible ecological damage. This requires not just better security measures but also international cooperation to address the global demand for illegal wildlife products. Diane continues to receive reports from current and former Park Service employees who suspect similar activities in other locations. The patterns she documented at Glacier National Park have been observed in other parks, suggesting that wildlife trafficking networks continue to operate despite increased law enforcement attention. The reports describe the same warning signs that Diane had learned to recognize: the disappearance of research animals, suspicious activities by park personnel, and evidence of organized hunting operations in restricted areas. But many potential witnesses are reluctant to come forward, afraid of the personal consequences of challenging powerful criminal organizations. The demand for rare trophy animals remains strong among wealthy collectors who view protected species as the ultimate hunting challenges. As long as there are people willing to pay enormous sums for illegal access to protected wildlife, there will be criminal networks ready to provide those services. The technological capabilities available to modern wildlife traffickers have made their operations more sophisticated and harder to detect. Advanced communication systems, GPS tracking, and other technologies that were originally developed for legitimate wildlife research can be adapted for illegal hunting operations. The globalization of wildlife trafficking has created criminal networks that operate across multiple countries and jurisdictions, making law enforcement coordination more complex and difficult. The same factors that facilitate legitimate international trade and communication also benefit criminal organizations that exploit protected species. Diane's investigation proved that America's national parks are not immune to organized criminal exploitation. The vast wilderness areas that protect the country's most precious wildlife resources also provide perfect cover for illegal activities conducted by people who understand how to avoid detection and eliminate threats to their operations. The wildlife that Diane dedicated her career to protecting continues to face threats from poaching networks that operate with sophisticated methods and extensive resources. Some of those threats come from people who are supposed to be protecting the animals they are actually helping to destroy. The corruption that enabled the Glacier National Park trafficking network was not unique to that location or those individuals. The same vulnerabilities exist throughout America's protected areas, and similar conspiracies are probably operating in other locations where wealthy criminals can buy access to rare and protected species. The mountains and forests of Glacier National Park are quiet again, but Diane knows that the silence doesn't necessarily mean the threats have ended. The criminal networks that exploit protected wildlife are adaptable and persistent, finding new ways to operate even after major enforcement actions. The ongoing threat to America's protected wildlife requires constant vigilance from law enforcement agencies, park personnel, and the general public. The enormous profits available from wildlife trafficking ensure that criminal organizations will continue attempting to exploit vulnerable species, regardless of the legal consequences. But the most disturbing lesson from Diane's investigation is that the greatest threats to protected wildlife may come from within the organizations tasked with conservation responsibilities. When the protectors become the predators, America's most precious natural heritage becomes nothing more than a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Somewhere in America's protected wilderness, criminal networks continue to hunt the rarest and most precious wildlife, serving clients who view protected species as trophies to be claimed regardless of law or conservation necessity. And some of those facilitating the hunting are the same people paid to protect what they are actually helping to destroy, turning America's greatest conservation success stories into private hunting preserves for those wealthy enough to buy access to anything they desire. The war between conservation and exploitation continues in the deep places of America's wilderness, where vast sums of money can buy access to experiences that should belong to future generations. In that war, the animals have no voice except for people like Diane who risk everything to speak for them. But as Diane learned, sometimes the greatest enemies of wildlife protection are found among those who claim to be its greatest defenders.